Chapter 21. Everyone looked at each other in dismay, their eyes filled with disbelief. This was simply the biggest joke in the world. Not only did she not admit to killing someone in front of the Emperor, she even wanted to be rewarded. After a long silence, Emperor Gong suddenly burst out laughing. He laughed so happily that no one dared to refute Gong Yimo's words at this time. It seemed that he had not been this happy for a long time. His eyebrows were full of joy. Such a smart and intelligent child, he really could not help but like her. You're right, I am the law. I'll reward whoever I want to. Changshi. This servant is here. Pass down my decree. 7th princess will be conferred the title of Chaoyang Princess, Wuji Palace. 9th prince will be conferred the Tai-He Palace and move out of the Cold Palace from today onwards. This servant obeys the decree. Changshi sucked in a breath of cold air in his heart. Wuji Palace was the place where the emperor lived when he was still a prince, but he actually gave it to 7th princess and conferred the title of Chaoyang Princess. Presumably, when this decree was passed down, many people would not be able to sleep tonight. Not to mention how jealous the people accompanying them were. Gong Dai was not unhappy at all. In his opinion, the place with Gong Yimo was the best place. He did not want to leave at all. Hearing the emperor's decree, Gong Yimo let out a sigh of relief. She smiled proudly at Gong Dai, who was close at hand. Just as she was about to say something, her vision turned black and she fainted. Just now, she was holding on with a single breath, but now that she won, she could no longer hold on. Royal sister. Gong Dai was frightened and wanted to hug her, but he was also seriously injured. How could he hug her? The two of them fell to the ground together. Looking at her lifeless appearance, Gong Dai only felt that the world suddenly turned scarlet red. If she could no longer open those eyes, if she could no longer smile at him, then what was the use of fighting for everything? Gong Dai half-hugged her, his eyes became redder and redder. The emperor was anxious and quickly frowned. Imperial physician. Go, summon the imperial physician to the palace. The surrounding people were in a mess and hurriedly left. However, Gong Dai did not seem to hear anything. He only saw Gong Yimo's pale lips and weak face. The blood on her face had scabbed and was being wiped away by him bit by bit. Royal sister, Gong Yimo, this person was his everything. Not to mention how much Gong Dai's heart ached. When Imperial Physician Dan saw the state Gong Yimo was in, he couldn't care less about the etiquette between men and women anymore. If this dragged on, he might not even be able to keep his life. Gong Qing was even more shocked. There were a total of 12 fatal wounds on Gong Yimo's body. It was hard to imagine how a 10-year-old child could endure the pain of fainting and negotiate with him. That domineering little face, could it be that she did not know pain? Gong Qing felt that even he couldn't do this when he was 10 years old. If Gong Yimo was a boy, he was afraid that he would have a headache. But now, seeing that she was so weak, Gong Qing only felt distressed. When imperial concubine Shui died, he treated Gong Yimo as a bastard and directly banished her to the Cold Palace. It was not that he did not regret it later, but that feeling was very faint. The palace was too big, and the death of a child was nothing at all. He never thought that this child would appear in front of him so strongly again. It shocked him, softened his heart, and even made him unable to punish her. In the end, she was as stubborn as her mother, but compared to her mother, she was much more outstanding. Gong Dai followed Gong Yimo throughout the process. He did not listen to the emperor's orders. The emperor was soft-hearted. He and Gong Yimo had depended on each other for many years, so he let him be. So, he saw with his own eyes how the imperial physician tore apart her clothes and treated her like a rag doll. Those deep and shallow scars, every single one of them had been left behind because of him. She was so beautiful, why would someone in this world be willing to be so cruel to her? The whole treatment process was like death by 1,000 cuts to Gong Dai. He held Gong Yimo's hand tightly. Usually, she would be delicate for a long time when she was bitten by an insect and needed him to coax her. She was extremely afraid of pain, and even a small injury would be known to everyone. Gong Dai really couldn't imagine how painful it was for her to suffer so many injuries. If possible, he hoped that all these injuries would be transferred to his own body, so that the guilt and heartache in his heart would be less. The imperial physician saw that Gong Dai only casually applied some medicine and was very dissatisfied. "Your Highness, your wounds need to be rebandaged." Gong Dai did not even spare him a glance. He only looked at her face that was even paler after washing. He reached out to touch her face to make sure that she was still alive. She was his whole world. After the Empress returned to the palace, she angrily smashed everything in front of her. She was not reconciled. That bastard. It was fine if her mother could get the Emperor's favor, but why could a bastard like her also get the Emperor's favor? Chaoyang Princess. Why could a bastard be called Chaoyang Princess, while her daughter, the daughter of the Empress, was only given the title of Princess Qingse? She was not satisfied. She was not satisfied. When the crown prince came in, he saw the floor full of debris and the silent palace servants. He shook his head and said to the Empress, "Why is Imperial Mother so angry?" In his opinion, the one who should be more angry should be Lu Xianfei, who lost a good general. Why was his mother so angry? Seeing him, the Empress' anger subsided a little. "Che, come here." Gong Che obediently walked over. At the age of 14, Gong Che had a pair of very gentle eyes. He waved to the other palace servants and they quickly retreated, leaving only the mother and son to talk. Looking at Gong Che's face that grew more and more handsome as he grew up, the Empress felt a little relieved. Her son did not look like her, nor did he look like the Emperor, but he was gentle, honest, and knowledgeable. Why couldn't she get the Emperor's favor with such an excellent son? He favored Long Guifei, Lu Xianfei's child, but why did he treat that bastard Gong Yimo differently as well? Thinking about it, her expression became twisted again. Just now, Gong Che followed behind the Empress and also witnessed everything. He thought for a moment and asked, "Imperial Mother, are you angry with ninth brother?" In his opinion, a prince was far more threatening than a princess. The Empress snorted, an unfavored prince was not in her eyes. Imperial Mother is angry with that bastard. What right does she have? After saying that, the Empress felt that she had misspoken and slightly frowned. Because in order to save the Emperor's face, she killed all the people who knew that Gong Yimo was not the Emperor's child. There were no more than 5 people who knew. Gong Che did not think so much, but the Empress's words made him think of that proud figure, and he could not help but feel a little absent-minded. He had seen so many daughters of aristocratic families, and most of them were gentle and elegant, or naive and cute. He had thought that all women in the world were like this, and that he liked these gentle ladies. He had never thought that there would be a day when such a person would appear in his world so powerfully, and leave a lingering impression in his mind. Chapter 22. Originally, he only saw that Gong Dai had come to ask for help. He was afraid of Gong Dai's martial arts skills, but he didn't take the royal sister seriously. When he rushed to the cold palace with everyone, the bleak courtyard and the lingering smell of blood made him frown. The courtyard door was opened, and the cold palace was dark. The ground was full of corpses and the drifting rain intertwined, forming a hellish scene. Only when the palace lanterns came in did the girl sitting on the stone platform move. Her long hair was tangled in front of her forehead. She raised her jade-white face, and her eyes shot over like lightning. Gong Che lost his breath. His whole mind seemed to be extinguished, filled with her cold eyes. Moreover, Gong Che faintly felt that the other party seemed to have seen him at first glance before her eyes landed on Imperial Father. This knowledge made one's heart palpitate. How could there be such a girl in the world? She was different from everyone he had met. Her sword was stained with blood, and she killed people without hesitation. Blood splattered all over her face, but she didn't care and wiped it away. She laughed when she wanted to. There was a ground full of corpses under her feet. It was a mixture of rain and blood. She was cold and cruel, but in front of everyone, she protected Ninth Brother in her arms and took on everyone's malicious slander. She was bathed in blood and talked cheerfully with Imperial Father. She proudly asked for a reward from Imperial Father. No wonder Imperial Father liked her. Such a beautiful, tough, and dazzling child, he also liked her. The thought only lasted for a moment before Gong Che came back to his senses. He had long forgotten that the Empress had called him a bastard. He gently comforted the Empress and coaxed her until she laughed before leaving. At this time, the sky was already bright. Xiao Qiao, who was holding the palace lantern in front, looked at the Crown Prince behind her. She sighed in her heart. The Crown Prince was a good Crown Prince, but because of the decline of the Empress and the rise of the two favored concubines, the Crown Prince didn't have an easy time. Moreover, there were already many princes and princesses. Now, there were two more people competing with the Crown Prince for favor. Is there any news from Taiji Palace? Hearing the Crown Prince's voice, Xiao Qiao was slightly stunned. After a while, she shook her head. I heard that he was seriously injured. I'm afraid there won't be any news for a day or two. Thinking of that proud and upright figure, no matter what, it was his imperial sister. He thought to himself that when he went back, he would send that bottle of your own powder to her. It was a big deal for a girl to have scars on her body. When Gong Yimo woke up, it was already 10 days later. When she opened her eyes, she saw the shockingly thin Gong Dai. She was shocked by the pair of black eyes that were even more prominent because of his thinness. What are you doing? Her voice was still hoarse. Because she had not eaten for a long time, she was very weak. After being scolded by her, Gong Dai was pleasantly surprised. Royal sister. You're awake. His voice was terrifyingly hoarse and his eyes were bloodshot. He looked even scarier than her, who had been lying in bed for more than 10 days. Gong Yimo's hand hurt from his grip, so she glared at him angrily. Brat, I'm about to starve to death. Just as she finished speaking, Gong Dai was stunned. He turned around and quickly called for someone to deliver food. At this moment, his eyes were bright, and there was no trace of coldness in them. It was as if his entire person had been injected with infinite vitality. Gong Yimo looked at his small figure as he dashed out. She smiled helplessly, but her heart was slightly warm. It wasn't easy to gain some weight, but he slimmed back down again. Because the emperor forbade anyone from visiting, Gong Yimo had been very comfortable these few days. After half a month, she was lively again. At this moment, she was gorging herself and stuffing food into Gong Dai's bowl. Looking at his helpless expression, she sighed. This is life. In comparison, what the hell were we eating before? Gong Dai looked at the delicacies in front of him. They were so exquisite that he could not see the ingredients. He did not think that they were delicious. In his memory, the most delicious food was the drumstick that they had shared for the first time. As for the rest, as long as Royal Sister was here, anything was fine. You have to eat more. Gong Yimo pinched Gong Dai's face. Finally, he was not as scary as half a month ago. Children are cute when they eat more. Gong Dai put down his chopsticks and said seriously, I'm not a child anymore. Gong Yimo's eyes widened. He had no choice but to pick up his chopsticks again. Only then did he smile. Eat more and grow faster. You can't go wrong listening to your royal sister. Why was she feeding him like a pig? Gong Dai felt like sighing again. To royal sister, it seemed that as long as she could eat and sleep, there was nothing difficult. However, looking at the lively smile in front of him, it was okay to eat until he was full. After they finished eating, Gong Dai went to class. Now that he had entered the Imperial College, he had to start from scratch because he had no foundation. Because Gong Dai had just been seriously injured, the other classes had to be delayed. Gong Dai did not expect that not long after he left, an unexpected guest would come to Taiji Palace. Gong Che had asked the emperor for permission to enter. He guessed that his imperial father wanted to protect Gong Yimo, but this kind of protection was the most enviable. Thinking of this, he shook his head and stepped inside. Gong Yimo had very complicated feelings towards Gong Che. In her previous life, she was willing to risk her life for this man, but he loved someone else. In this life, she was not Gong Yimo, who left the palace, but his imperial sister. The secret that they were not blood relatives was pitifully little known. Perhaps he would treat her as his imperial sister for the rest of his life. Although their circumstances were completely different, Gong Yimo did not know how to treat him. Speak ill of him. She did not need to rashly make enemies for herself. Gong Yimo could not figure out such a complicated problem, so she decided not to think about it. Regardless of what would happen between him and Su Miaolan in the future, she had already firmly held onto the thigh of the future Prince Regent. Holding onto the thigh of the future Emperor was nothing. Thinking of this, Gong Yimo smiled sweetly at him. She herself did not think that she could be so free and easy. Her eyebrows were gradually growing, and she had inherited imperial concubine Shui's snow-like skin. Her bright eyes and white teeth made her smile very alluring. Gong Che was stunned. He only felt an unprecedented emotion rise in his heart. It was hard for him to reconcile her with the killing spirit he saw that night. However, the other party's smile was very cute. He could not help but reach out to touch the other party's head. The child's obedient appearance made his heart soften. Children who grew up in the cold palace were naturally strong, but she also knew how to be clever. She was really a child that made one's heart ache. Big brother Crown Prince, can I call you that? Being touched on the head did not matter at all. Gong Yimo blinked and asked with a fawning expression. Gong Che smiled, of course you can. My name is Gong Che, Zihingyong. According to the ranking, I am your third imperial brother. Gong Yimo held her breath slightly. Her face turned red as she continued to act cute. That's great. I also have an older brother. Big brother Crown Prince is really good looking. You are the most beautiful person I have ever seen. Gong Yimo did not lie at all. Gong Che's face was very good, and there were no ugly concubines in the harem. Their children were all very beautiful. Among them, Gong Che and Gong Dai were outstanding. Chapter 23. Gong Che blushed at Gong Yimo's straightforward praise. He sighed slightly and pulled Gong Yimo to sit down in the room. After a moment, he said, girls should be reserved. You can't praise people so easily, especially men. Reserved. This word made Gong Yimo's expression unnatural for a moment. In her past life, she pursued Gong Che like a moth to a flame, and even drove away countless women to monopolize his harem. Many people scolded her behind her back for being unrestrained, but she didn't care. She was a person of the future, and if she liked someone, she liked them. She couldn't be slow or coy. Presumably, it was because she got it too easily that Gong Che didn't cherish her in her past life and liked the reserved and beautiful Su Miaolan instead. She reflected on her mistakes with a heavy face. Gong Che knew that he had misspoken. Gong Yimo grew up in the cold palace and no one taught her manners. If he said that she wasn't reserved, wouldn't that mean that she had no manners? Looking at her suddenly dispirited little face, Gong Che actually felt distressed and hurriedly tried to remedy the situation. But it doesn't matter to me. Gong Yimo raised her head to look at him. Gong Che unconsciously revealed a very gentle smile, and his eyes were filled with warmth. You're my little sister. You can treat me well, but not outsiders. Gong Yimo knew that he was comforting her. He had always been such a gentle and meticulous person. This kind of person was most likely to attract inexperienced little girls. Gong Yimo nodded repeatedly. I'll remember. Gong Che was very pleased with her obedience, so he took out the jade face powder that he had prepared long ago and gave it to her. You've just recovered from your injury. This medicine is good for growing muscles and removing scars. Take it and use it. Gong Yimo touched the cold jade bottle in her hand. She didn't have the slightest intention of refusing and held it tightly. Her heart was slightly moved. She knew how precious this jade face powder was, and she also knew that it wasn't easy for Gong Che to be the crown prince. She didn't expect that he would give her such an important thing as soon as they met. Thinking of this, she grinned. Then I'll have to thank Crown Prince Gage. The girl's straightforwardness made Gong Che's heart ache even more. He searched his body. It was a pity that he didn't bring anything other than medicine. Otherwise, he really wanted to give her something else. After gaining some benefits, Gong Yimo also increased her favorability towards Su Miaolan and began to chase her away. Thinking that Su Miaolan would only appear in a few years, she could take her time and wasn't in a hurry at all. Looking at Gong Che's back, Gong Yimo smiled sweetly while thinking. In the evening, as soon as Gong Dai came back, he asked about Gong Che. Gong Yimo was puzzled. This guy's information network was quite flexible. You mean brother Crown Prince? Gong Yimo took out the medicine bottle with a smile. He's here to deliver the medicine to me. He's a nice guy. Gong Yimo's praise made Gong Dai very dissatisfied. In the past, Royal Sister would only praise him, let alone call others so intimately. Gong Dai stared coldly at the bottle of medicine. Royal Sister's injury has already been applied with the best medicine by Imperial Father. After the scab falls off, there won't be any scars at all. This was also the reason why the women in the Imperial harem were crazy with jealousy recently. Jade face powder could only be produced 3 bottles a year. Even if it wasn't used to treat injuries, it could make the skin glow if applied directly. However, the 2 bottles in the Emperor's hands were all used by Gong Yimo. This honor was unprecedented. Gong Yimo naturally knew. As she pulled Gong Dai into the room, she said, "Of course I know, so this medicine is for you." As soon as she finished speaking, Gong Dai, who was secretly sulking, was stunned. He was directly pulled into the bedchamber by Gong Yimo. Only when he sat on the bed did he regain his senses. So Royal Sister was still Royal Sister. She had always been thinking about him. At this time, all the palace servants in the bedchamber had retreated, leaving only the 2 of them. It seemed that they hadn't been alone like this for a long time, making Gong Dai miss it very much. "All right, quickly take off your clothes. I'll apply the medicine for you." Gong Yimo stood by the bed and stared condescendingly at Gong Dai. "Don't think that I don't know that your injury hasn't been treated properly. It hasn't healed even now. Look at your pale face. No wonder you can't get fat no matter how I feed you." It was really infuriating. Children were only healthy when they were white and chubby. Especially with arms like lotus roots, they were the most adorable. Gong Dai felt nervous for no reason. He didn't know why, but after Gong Yimo was injured this time, something in his heart seemed to have changed. In the past, he really wanted to get closer to Gong Yimo. Now that Gong Yimo was close to him, he felt nervous and helpless, and his heart was beating fast. Now that Gong Yimo was very close, he retreated a little and said with difficulty, "Royal sister, I can go back and get the other palace servants to help me apply the medicine." Gong Yimo frowned impatiently. "I don't trust any of the people in this harem. You better listen to me obediently. It's not good if you force me to use force. Even if she used force, she might not be able to beat him now." They were both at the 3rd level of wind and nature. However, her royal sister's prestige still made Gong Dai obediently submit. He took off his prince's robe and put it aside. He was only wearing a white undergarment. His eyes were cold and clear, and his eyebrows were raised. He already had the beauty of the future. At this moment, his head was lowered, and his long eyelashes were obediently drooping. The side of his face was so exquisite that it would be too much if it was too little, if it was too little, if it was too little. After Gong Yimo had her fill of eye candy, she let Gong Dai continue to take off his clothes. Very quickly, his back was facing Gong Yimo, revealing his entire back. The bandages that were still seeping blood destroyed the beauty for no reason. Gong Yimo's expression slowly became serious. She slowly cut open the bandages, revealing the wound that had not healed. A trace of heartache flashed past her eyes. This was the child that she had raised single-handedly, but he was hurt by others like this. He was still so small, and his shoulders were still so thin and weak. She did not know how he had barged in front of the emperor and begged him to save her. Gong Yimo was very clear that if he had not arrived in time, she was afraid that the 3rd life that she had painstakingly obtained would have ended in the cold palace. Gong Yimo's hand was a bit cold, and the touch of it on his shoulder made him feel itchy for no reason. His face was uncontrollably burning red, but in his heart, he knew that the feelings he had for the royal sister were different from the feelings she had for him. He did not know why, but in the royal sister's heart, he was not a younger brother that was 1 year younger than her. Instead, he was more like a junior. Therefore, she had never cared about these physical intimacies. But he cared. There was a trace of an indescribable feeling in his heart. He did not understand what it was, but he knew that it must be related to the royal sister. Because in his world, the most important thing was her. When she was applying the medicine, Gong Yimo did not speak, which was rare. She seemed to be very unhappy. Perhaps she hated those who had hurt him, but it was more likely that she was angry at herself for not protecting him well. Her little mouth was slightly pouty, which made her look a little cute. Gong Dai secretly laughed. "Royal sister, the Grand Tutor praised me today. He said that I do not stick to one pattern when looking at problems, and that my views are unique." Oh. Gong Yimo felt that this was normal. The child that she had raised was not ordinary to begin with. At this moment, after the medicine was applied on his back, Gong Yimo came to apply on his chest. Her breath suddenly approached him. Before Gong Dai could react, it had already wrapped around him in layers. He could not help but hold his breath and look elsewhere. Chapter 24. Originally, Imperial Father thought that I didn't know anything. After he tested me, he was very surprised and rewarded me with many things. Later, I'll have people bring them all to you. Gong Yimo smiled with gratification. At least you have a conscience. But since it's for you, I don't want it. Do you remember what I said these days? She had always hoped that Gong Ju would hide his incompetence before his wings were fully grown. She wanted him to leave an impression that he wasn't too scheming and was only muscular. Gong Ju nodded. I remember. Most of the time, I only performed a little. I was neither outstanding nor at the bottom. Only mediocrity was the most normal. Whether he was too outstanding or not, it would attract people's attention. He couldn't protect himself now, so this was the only way. Gong Dai's expression fell silent. At this moment, Gong Yimo's fingertips suddenly brushed across the small bulge in front of his chest. He trembled and all the thoughts in his mind were thrown to Java. His face suddenly turned red, so red that one could fry an egg. This, I can do the front myself. As he spoke, he was about to take the medicine bottle. Unexpectedly, Gong Yimo raised it up high with a naughty smile on her face. It turns out that our highness is so pure. That won't do. If you're too pure, you'll be taken away by other women at the first awakening of love. I have to train you on this. As she spoke, she ignored his stiff body and continued to apply the medicine on his body. He didn't know if it was intentional or not, but her fingertips gently slid to his abdomen. He nervously inhaled and felt the air become hot, but he didn't even dare to resist. Royal sister was always like this. She was so careless that she didn't care about this at all. Just thinking about it made him feel very discouraged. He raised his head and silently controlled himself. However, those tightly pursed thin lips and black jade-like eyes seemed to be able to speak. Gong Yimo felt that she couldn't look too much. She was afraid that she would turn into a wolf. Although she thought so, her hands couldn't help but be naughty. She pinched here and there and was very satisfied. You're indeed a child that I raised. Your muscles are so well proportioned and beautiful. In the future, if other women come near you, you have to be careful not to be taken advantage of. Suddenly, Gong Dai grabbed Gong Yimo's hand. His eyes were burning with passion and forbearance. All of a sudden, all the words Gong Yimo wanted to say were blocked in her mouth. His stare made her heart tremble. Gong Yimo looked at him in confusion. At this moment, one of them was sitting while the other was leaning forward. They were so close to each other that the air became hot. No one else. Gong Ju fixed his eyes on her. He grabbed her hand and slowly placed it on his chest, then slowly opened his mouth. No one else. Only the royal sister can get close to me. No one else. Gong Yimo was shocked by his actions and words. She quickly retracted her hand, but her face could not help but turn red. She looked away, but she could still feel his burning gaze on her, clear and serious. At this moment, she could no longer treat him as a child. Unknowingly, he had already grown up. When he was serious and focused, he was as convincing as an adult. Treating Gong Dai as an adult. When Gong Yimo thought of this, she hurriedly spurned herself and said vaguely. What nonsense are you talking about? You still have to get married in the future. You won't even touch your wife. Do you still want to have children? After saying this, she felt that she had gone too far. Gong Dai was only 9 years old. He did not understand what she meant by having children. However, she did not know that in ancient times, 9 years old was not young. Children in ancient times matured early. They could marry at 14 years old. It was not rare for them to have children at 12 years old. Gong Yimo had always used modern standards to measure him, so she always treated him as a child. Seeing that the royal sister was obviously avoiding him, Gong Dai also felt that his words had frightened her. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he was as cold and shy as usual. No one knew what he was really thinking. He said softly, "It doesn't matter if I don't have children. Royal sister is the person who treats me the best. As long as I have royal sister, it's fine." What a sensible child. Gong Yimo immediately threw the strange emotions to the back of her head. In her heart, she was determined that in this life, she would definitely find a good girl for Gong Dai. What Su Miaoan? Scram far away. In a flash, another month had passed. Gong Dai's injuries were more or less healed. He had finally met all of his siblings. In total, there were 39 of them. The oldest was 22 years old and had already left the residence. The youngest was still in swaddling clothes. Because Gong Yimo was favored, the good things bestowed by the emperor flowed like water into Taiji Palace. They were also arrogantly moved to Taiha Palace by Gong Yimo. Even the emperor turned a blind eye to it, so no one dared to say anything. Therefore, Gong Dai was despised and envied, but no one feared him. As the person involved, Gong Dai naturally felt the envy of his siblings. Because the emperor had too many children, there were only a few who were favored. They were all at the age where they longed for a father's love. They didn't dare to do anything to Gong Yimo, who didn't go to school to slack off, but they dared to give Gong Dai a hard time. Gong Dai grew up in the cold palace, so his mind was not immature. He ignored all the gazes. The royal sister had given him the highest order. Before he grew up, she would protect him. Gong Dai was helpless. Sometimes he felt sullen, but more often than not, he felt warmth. He regarded the royal sister as his one and only, but wasn't the royal sister the same? On this day, after Gong Dai's class, he was stopped by a boy who was a year older than him. When he saw who the other party was, Gong Dai's little face tightened, secretly vigilant. The person who came was Lu Xianfei's son, Gong Qi. Seeing him, Gong Dai couldn't help but think of his mother's appearance when she passed away. At that time, his mother seemed to have been poisoned, and in a few days, her whole body withered. At that time, all the evidence pointed to Lu Xianfei, but after seeing Lu Xianfei, his mother's heart was like dead ashes, and she passed away that night. Before she died, his mother took his hand and lamented with tears in her eyes, "It's a pity that I can't see you grow up." At that time, Gong Dai was too young, and didn't understand the thousands of words behind her sad eyes. He only remembered that his mother took his hand and said over and over again, "Mother's death, she deserved it. Don't take revenge, don't take revenge." When she said those words, she really didn't want him to take revenge. Until now, Gong Dai didn't understand why. Gong Qi looked down on Gong Dai. A child who didn't have a mother, in the palace, relied on a girl to survive, but he wouldn't admit it. How jealous was he? Gong Yimo's appearance occupied the emperor's entire line of sight. Even he, who was very favored at that time, hadn't seen his father for more than half a month now. So he was also jealous. Jealous that Gong Yimo was favored, and even more jealous that Gong Yimo treated Gong Dai wholeheartedly. What was so great about him? What's the matter? Gong Dai's voice was faint, and his eyebrows were slightly knitted. Nothing, I just wanted to see what a prince who relied on a woman to survive looks like. Now that I see it, it's really more beautiful than the palace maids by my side. Chapter 25. The little Gong Dai is indeed stunningly beautiful, but the other party used his face to humiliate him, mocking him for not being a man. Gong Dai looked at him coldly. He had been humiliated far worse than this, who knows how many times. He really had no interest in bickering with Gong Qi. "If there's nothing else, I'll take my leave first." He gave a standard salute, then got up and left. Behind him, Gong Qi angrily shouted, "You really are a coward. I'm humiliating you like this, can't you hear me?" Gong Dai's footsteps paused, and without turning his head, he said, "My royal brother's appearance is ordinary, and because of jealousy, he spoke ill of me. I won't continue to provoke you. That's to say I'm ugly." Gong Dai's face turned green with anger. His appearance is indeed ordinary, but those who have seen him all say he's handsome, calm, and magnanimous. Only Gong Dai would dare to say such a thing. Humph, what's the use of being good-looking? You're just using your looks to please others. Mother said that one day Gong Yimo will not want you. When that time comes, I'll see what you can do." He said with such certainty, and his words were like a thorn, deeply piercing into Gong Dai's heart. Everything else didn't matter, but when it came to Gong Yimo, he couldn't ignore it. Lu Xianfei wouldn't say such things for no reason, so what did she mean by that? Gong Ju abruptly turned his head, and his cold eyes stared at Gong Qi. He straightened his neck. You dare to stare at me? Just you wait, when Gong Yimo doesn't want you, I'll make you pay. After saying that, he quickly turned around and left. It's not that he didn't dare to touch Gong Dai, but that his mother didn't allow him to. Previously, his 14th brother relied on his young age and arrogantly asked Gong Dai to be his horse. Gong Dai ignored him and left, but when Gong Yimo heard about this, she ordered someone to beat him. When the emperor found out, not only did he not blame her, he even said that his 14th brother was impolite and punished him to copy the palace rules 10 times. From this, one could see how much he doted on her. However, he was still angry, so he blurted out the words that his mother had inadvertently said. Afterwards, he regretted it a bit. Gong Dai was even more distracted. Why was Lu Xianfei so sure that the royal sister wouldn't want him? He did not care if others said that he was incompetent, nor did he care if others tried to sow discord between them. He only cared about the royal sister. Even during the coronation ceremony, he felt that it was a blessing for his name to appear alongside the royal sisters. Unable to figure it out, Gong Dai's face darkened. He decided to ask him personally. Lu Xianfei was indeed a favored concubine. Her fragrance palace was the place with the most plants in the entire imperial palace. The fragrance of flowers permeated the air all year round. Once you entered, you would feel as if you were immersed in a sea of flowers. At this time, Gong Dai coldly watched as the head maid went in to report. After class, Lu Xianfei had already heard the news. She just didn't expect Gong Dai to come to her door so quickly. Thinking of Lu Mo's tragic death, her eyes flashed a trace of hatred. If she could create a rift between him and that little bitch Gong Yimo, she would be able to vent her anger. Thinking of this, she sat behind the screen and hummed. If that's the case, let him come in. The palace maid nodded and hurriedly left. Gong Ju then walked in steadily. This was only the outer hall, but it was beautifully built. Gong Dai couldn't help but think of his mother. Every time the emperor or father bestowed gifts, she would lock them away. Unlike Lu Xianfei, she would not display them anywhere. Even though he was reluctant, Gong Ju still bowed to Lu Xianfei. Behind the screen, he could vaguely see a woman dressed in a palace dress, surrounded by pearls and jade. Her eyes were cold and full of disgust even though they were separated by the screen. May I know what business the 9th prince has with me? Gong Dai didn't beat around the bush. After class today, 6th brother said something to me. I couldn't understand it, so I came to ask. He was really anxious. He was very concerned about the matter with that little girl. That's good. She loved to see people turn against each other. Oh. Her coquettish voice dragged out the word, with a trace of mischief. May I know which sentence your highness is referring to? When Gong Ju heard this, his lips tightened. After a long time, he said, everyone knows that my sister and I share a deep sibling relationship. I don't know why 6th brother vowed that sister would abandon me in the future. That's why I asked this question. Humph, what a deep sibling relationship. The woman behind the screen changed her posture and suddenly asked after a while. I wonder if your highness still remembers your birth mother. Of course I remember. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the screen. He felt that mentioning his mother at this time wasn't a good thing. Then, Lu Xianfei threw a coquettish wink and smiled even more enchanting. Then do you know, why did your mother die? Gong Dai didn't speak. He naturally knew that all the evidence pointed to this woman in front of him. While he was silent, the woman giggled. You must think it was me, right? Gong Dai's face changed. He said lightly, I don't think so. Unexpectedly, the woman behind the screen laughed. Is that so? But this consort will tell you now, this consort was the one who personally poisoned your mother. Lu Xianfei's sudden and earth-shattering words finally broke Gong Ju's facade. His face turned extremely ugly. Because Lu Xianfei wouldn't lie to him like this. Was she so sure that he couldn't take revenge now? At this time, Lu Xianfei waved her hand and the palace servants pushed the screen away. Gong Dai saw a woman in a splendid dress leaning on a gold-rimmed wooden chair. She smiled at him proudly. There was no shame on her face. She said those words without any burden. She was so luxurious. Compared to the simple mother in his memory, it was like heaven and earth. Gong Dai couldn't help but ask. Why did you do this? He suppressed his anger. He was afraid that his actions would bring trouble to Gong Yimo. But the hatred of his mother's death was irreconcilable. If his mother hadn't died, he wouldn't be reduced to this state. Lu Xianfei saw that he could still control himself in this situation. Her eyes flashed with a trace of fear, but her mouth still smiled. It's true that I killed your mother, but I was also ordered by someone. Here, she smiled even more. She looked at Gong Dai with enchanting eyes. Who do you think in this world can order me to do such a thing? Gong Dai's body shook. He looked at Lu Xianfei in disbelief. Who else could it be? Only the Emperor. Only the Emperor. Impossible, this. Why? Gong Dai couldn't believe it. He didn't understand. His imperial mother had wasted her entire life for his imperial father. When his imperial father smiled, she was even happier. When his imperial father was angry, she was even more worried. Why did he want to kill a woman who treated him wholeheartedly? Lu Xianfei narrowed her eyes. Why, of course, it's for your good royal sister's mother, Xuefei. Her voice became cold. It seemed that Xuefei was a person she hated and didn't want to mention. She looked at Gong Dai coldly. Even the charming smile on her face disappeared. Chapter 26. Back then, concubine Xue was as favored as the Chaoyang princess today. She snorted, the emperor was at the peak of his power. Who didn't praise him for his ambitions? The harem had 30,000 sisters. Although they weren't evenly distributed, they could still occasionally see the emperor. But since concubine Xue appeared, everything changed. The emperor's vision gradually became monotonous. Even if he went to see other women, it was just a formality. That year, when she first entered the palace, seeing concubine Xue, she was also crazy with jealousy. Thinking of this, she smiled faintly. Concubine Xue was unparalleled in her favor. Many women in the harem were jealous of her. Many tried to assassinate her, but they all failed. Because the emperor was too careful, they didn't have a chance. But, only your mother. Lu Xianfei looked away, the shadow of that person gradually appeared in her eyes. Li Qinghua, how long has it been since she thought of him? She was always dressed in light-colored clothes. Her smile was gentle and demure, and she had a scholarly aura around her. Your mother was also favored, but because of concubine Xue, she gradually became quiet. Then, I don't know how, but she became friends with concubine Xue. The emperor saw that concubine Xue rarely had a sister to talk to, so he didn't stop them. Instead, he took care of your mother. But not long after, concubine Xue died of a terrible disease. At that time, the emperor was so sad that he didn't want to live anymore. He ordered a thorough investigation, and finally found your mother. Concubine Xue wanted to entrust her daughter to your mother before she died, but your mother killed her. Is what you said true? Gong Dai spoke quickly. His eyes shot over like lightning, capturing Lu Xianfei's attention. His imperial mother was gentle and elegant. She was definitely not the scheming and murderous person that she had described. Lu Xianfei was shocked by his eyes, but then she snorted. Of course it's true. Your imperial mother loves books. Every time, she would bring some books for imperial concubine Xue to read. She would also dye the inside of the books with colorless and odorless poison. She really is a talented woman who has read a lot of books. Her methods are really brilliant. Once the poison is dried to a certain extent, it will lose its toxicity. If it weren't for the Emperor's timely blockade and thorough investigation, no one would know that it was her who did it in a day or two. So Imperial Father used Lu Xianfei to kill Imperial Mother. So when he was framed, Imperial Father arbitrarily decided to convict him and banished him to the Cold Palace. No, that can't be. Imperial Father doesn't need to borrow someone else's hand to kill people. This is illogical. His mother wasn't such a person, and he wasn't the son of royal sister's mother's murderer. Lu Xianfei did hide a part of it. That's right, at the time, the Emperor didn't even find out who did it. She had a female official who was familiar with medicine at her side. She was a trusted aide that her father had sent to her. By chance, her female official had smelled the fragrance of a poisonous flower on Li Shufei's body. Combined with Xue Fei's sudden death not long after, it aroused her suspicion. She pretended to be on good terms with Li Xianfei and ordered her confidant to search for evidence. Only then did she discover the pages stained with poison. That very night, she reported it to the Emperor. The Emperor was furious, so she volunteered to give her a taste of her own medicine. Her female official also knew how to make the poison. She was willing to poison the murderer for imperial concubine Xue. The Emperor gladly agreed, and after the deed was done, he gave her the title of Xianfei. Even when she schemed against Gong Dai and wanted to eliminate the root of the problem, the Emperor turned a blind eye to it. But she couldn't tell Gong Dai about this. It's up to you whether to believe it or not. Before Li Shufei died, she asked this consort. This consort said that this was His Majesty's will. She immediately returned in a daze and died that night. This consort can swear to the heavens that everything I said is true. Gong Dai looked at her, his eyes cold, but his heart was filled with sorrow. He couldn't help but think of the last few words his mother said before she died. 2 sentences, don't take revenge. 1 sentence, because she felt guilty, she wanted to pay with her life. Another sentence, because even in death, she still loved that man deeply, so she was willing to die. It's a pity that I can't see you grow up. Gong Dai felt like his whole body was wrapped in a giant cocoon, so suffocating that it almost drove him crazy. His mother killed imperial concubine Xue, and then died because of her. But because of her, royal sister was banished to the Cold Palace at the age of 3, and was bedridden for 4 years. If royal sister knew that he was the child of her mother's enemy, she would hate him. On the way back, Gong Dai seemed to have lost his soul. For the first time in his life, he was muddle-headed and didn't know what to do. Lu Xianfei's voice kept echoing in his ears. Chaoyang Princess values you because you were the one she depended on in the Cold Palace for 3 years. But if she knew that your mother was the one who caused her to be banished to the Cold Palace, I don't know how she would feel. Lu Xianfei laughed so happily. Sibling love. Your Highness better hope that she never finds out. Once she turns against you, your Highness won't be her opponent. Royal sister would hate him. For the first time, Gong Dai stopped outside the Taiji Palace, looking at the brightly lit place, vaguely able to hear her laughter. She was so dazzling. Just by her side, one could feel endless joy. Even the palace servants around her had smiles on their faces as they walked in and out. In this palace, she was so different from the rest. Gong Dai stood for a while, then turned and walked towards his own Taiha palace. There was some distance between the Taiha palace and the Taiha palace, but every time, Gong Dai felt like it would only take a quarter of an hour. Because he could see the royal sister, this distance was nothing. But this time, when he walked on the road to the Taiha palace, he felt that the road was so long, so dark, and so dark. The flames on both sides seemed to be able to eat people, but they couldn't disperse the thick darkness of the night. A few days later, Gong Yimo finally felt that something was wrong. She had never been a person who would restrict people's freedom, so when Gong Dai didn't appear for a day or two, she just thought that he had grown up and needed his own private space. But after not appearing for 5 days, Gong Yimo faintly felt that something was wrong. Just as she was about to go find him, a palace servant hurriedly ran over. Bad news, princess. His Highness the 9th Prince injured His Highness the 14th Prince at the Imperial College. His Majesty is questioning him. When Gong Yimo heard this, how could she still sit still? She quickly got up and used her qinggong to rush to the Imperial College. The Imperial College was a bit far from the Taiji Palace. When Gong Yimo arrived, everyone was kneeling on the ground, and the Emperor's angry voice rang out in the hall. Countless palace servants were silent out of fear. When Gong Yimo arrived, something was suddenly thrown at her. Gong Yimo subconsciously dodged, and didn't even look to see what it was. The Emperor's angry roar could be heard. Look at how you're protecting your good brother. Not only did you dare to go against me, you even heavily injured your own brother. What do you have to say? At this time, Gong Dai's body was completely red as he stood in front of the Emperor. When he heard the Emperor's words, he opened his bloodshot eyes and retorted with a hoarse voice. This matter has nothing to do with royal sister. Chapter 27. Shut up. Gong Yimo suddenly frowned and interrupted him. She didn't even look at Gong Dai and went straight to the furious Emperor. At this time, the Emperor's face was very ugly. She was secretly vigilant and patted his chest with her small hand. Her face was also panting with anger. Imperial father, calm down. Who made you so angry? This sun will help you vent your anger. Who else? Emperor Qing slightly narrowed his eyes and looked at his daughter in front of him. He suddenly thought of something and his tone softened a little, but he still angrily glared at Gong Dai. Why didn't he realize before that this usually taciturn brat could be so infuriating when he spoke? Gong Yimo smiled and comforted the Emperor for a while. Finally, she coaxed him to sit down. Then, she faced the crowd and said with a serious and cold expression, "What's going on? Someone come out and explain the reason." The people kneeling on the ground looked at each other. Finally, a person wearing a green eunuch uniform knelt down. Reporting to Princess, this servant is the attendant of His Highness the 14th Prince. Princess, please make a decision for His Highness. Gong Yimo looked at Gong Dai, who was standing straight and silent. She gritted her teeth and said, "Speak." The eunuch lowered his head and choked with sobs. His Highness the 14th Prince is young and ignorant. When he saw the wooden figurine in His Highness the 9th Prince's hands, he made a few jokes. Who knew that His Highness the 9th Prince would suddenly fly into a rage and severely injure His Highness the 14th Prince? Oh. Gong Yimo glanced at Gong Dai, who was obviously feverish. What did His Highness the 14th Prince say? Her words silenced everyone present. It was obvious that the Emperor had been angry because of this. The eunuch in green trembled slightly and whispered, "His Highness the 9th Prince carved a wooden figurine, and the face is very similar to Princess." So, His Highness the 14th Prince said, at this time, the eunuch who had been following Gong Dai knelt in front of Gong Yimo. "Princess, please forgive us. This is all because His Highness the 14th Prince spoke rudely to Princess. His Highness the 9th Prince was just angry. So angry that he could injure His Highness the 14th Prince. So much blood, and he's your brother. He's too ruthless. If His Highness 14th Prince did not say that it was improper for His Highness to admire the Princess of Chaoyang and that the Princess was promiscuous, His Highness 9th Prince would not be like this. His words silenced everyone present. Gong Yimo did not expect a child to speak so viciously. No, this wasn't something a child would think of. This was a vicious plan specifically targeted at her. Both she and the Emperor knew very well that she was not the Emperor's biological daughter. Therefore, the other party's words were not worth mentioning if it was the Emperor's biological daughter. The Emperor would even punish the person who spoke. However, the target was her, so the Emperor couldn't help but think more about it. No wonder the Emperor was so angry when she came in. Looking at the wooden figurine on the ground, Gong Yimo sighed. There were less than 5 people in the entire palace who knew about this. She didn't know who came up with such a plan and didn't hesitate to use the 14th Prince as cannon fodder. What a load of nonsense. Gong Yimo tried her best to make herself look extremely angry. She pointed at the people below, her fingers trembling. What else? Say it all together. This princess wants to know how much more excessive you can make up. Seeing her anger, everyone prostrated themselves at her feet and fearfully said, "Princess, calm down, calm down." At this time, Gong Yimo suddenly glared at the Emperor and pointed at the wooden figurine on the ground. "Father Emperor. Just now, you used that wooden figurine to hit a Ken. Was it because you listened to slander and doubted a Ken?" Her eyes were filled with disappointment, and her face turned red from shame and anger. The Emperor felt guilty under her gaze, but his suspicion was not wrong. Gong Yimo was not his child. Who knows if Xue Fei told her anything before she died? His gaze seemed to stab Gong Yimo. At this time, her whole body was trembling. She sneered, "Ridiculous, really ridiculous. Me and Gong Dai. Really ridiculous." After saying ridiculous several times, her expression suddenly darkened. "Father Emperor, do you know what the Cold Palace is?" Gong Qing stared blankly, not understanding why she suddenly said this. The Cold Palace, in the end, it's a place of lifelong imprisonment. When I was 3 years old, I was inexplicably banished to the Cold Palace. After that, I was bedridden in the Cold Palace for 4 years. There wasn't a day when I didn't think about what I did wrong. Why did Father Emperor, who loved me dearly, banish me to the Cold Palace? There were several times when I felt like I was going to die, but no one came to take care of me. Facing Gong Yimo's straightforward accusation, her slightly cold voice was filled with sorrow. He didn't know how a child lived through those 4 years. Thinking of this, Gong Qing couldn't bear to look away. He didn't know how to explain his decision at that time. Gong Yimo sneered again, her cold gaze sweeping the whole. Everyone lowered their heads. Only then did she look at Gong Dai, who seemed to be more silent because of her words, and slowly said, "Father Emperor, what do you think Gong Dai is to me?" Hearing this, the Emperor looked over with burning eyes. Gong Yimo laughed at herself. At that time, I was rumored to be suffering from tuberculosis. The 6-year-old Gong Dai was grateful to me for a meal. He wasn't afraid of infection and moved to my side. Later, when I was about to starve to death, it was Gong Dai who stole food for me to eat. Because of that little bit of food, I was humiliated and beaten half to death. The Cold Palace was so big and cold, but he was the only person who was good to me all these years. Her eyes were so gentle that Gong Dai couldn't help but raise his head to look at her, but soon he closed his eyes sadly. Gong Yimo frowned slightly, but didn't say anything. After I recovered from my illness, by chance, I found the wind and rain nature's internal strength cultivation method and swordsmanship in the abandoned well of the cold palace. I slowly learned it with Gong Dai, so that I wouldn't be bullied in the cold palace. So to me, Gong Dai wasn't just a younger brother, a family member, but also a friend and confidant. Because of the loneliness in the cold palace, he was forced to play all the roles by my side. In the cold palace, we took a bath together. When it rained, the place he lived in leaked, and the bed was wet. We even squeezed onto the same bed to sleep. We ate the same cold food and used the same handkerchief to wipe our faces. Why, are you going to drown me in a pig cage? Royal sister. Gong Dai suddenly shouted in a hoarse voice. It turned out that unknowingly, the bond between them had become so deep. Gong Yimo ignored him. Instead, she looked coldly at the shocked and ashamed emperor, and said loudly, "I was the one who taught Gong Dai to understand, I was the one who urged him to practice martial arts, and I was the one who stayed by his side when he was sick. To him, I was a sister, a teacher, a friend, and a mother. Now that my birthday is approaching, he asked me what I wanted. I said that as long as you put your heart into it, I would like it. But such deep feelings were distorted like this. Imperial Father, I want to ask, who was the one who threw me into the cold palace? Who was the one who caused me to lose my mother? Did I want to have no playmates, relatives, or teachers? What's wrong with me valuing him?" As she spoke, she stood in front of Gong Dai. Her long palace dress swayed, and the golden embroidery on the hem of her dress shone with a dazzling light. She faced the emperor and said loudly, "Today, even if Gong Dai killed 14 people, let alone just beating someone up, I will also stand on his side." Chapter 28. It's just that I can't bear the humiliation and infamy. If Imperial Father still suspects that we have an affair, her face pales and she grits her teeth, but in the end, she chokes out a laugh. If Imperial Father still suspects, then please send me back to the cold palace. It's just that Gong Dai, he's still so young. I hope Imperial Father can be a little merciful to him and let him stay. No, Gong Dai staggers slightly. With a serious expression, he firmly grasps Gong Yimo's hand. "Wherever Royal Sister is, I will be there." Gong Yimo's mind calms down. The two of them look at the emperor. She doesn't believe that Emperor Qing will still suspect them after she said so. Looking at Gong Yimo's stubborn eyes and unforgiving appearance, it seems that as long as he doubts her, she will immediately pack up and go to the cold palace. Emperor Qing can't help but hold his forehead with a guilty conscience. When did Shen say that I was suspicious? He looks at Gong Dai and bluffs. Shen is just angry that he injured my younger brother and still doesn't admit his mistake. That's all. Gong Dai looks at him coldly. "I'm not wrong." Emperor Qing glares and is about to flare up, but Gong Yimo kneels down. "Since that's the case, it's all because of me. I didn't teach my younger brother well. If Imperial Father wants to punish him, just punish me." Emperor Qing looks at the eyebrows and eyes that are very similar to Imperial concubine Shue's. Saying such words decisively and coldly, his heart suddenly hurts. If Imperial concubine Shue was half as firm as her daughter, it wouldn't be like this. Thinking like this, Emperor Qing suddenly gets up and glares at Gong Yimo. "Since that's the case, Shen will punish you to kneel in front of the Imperial College for 3 hours. Go quickly." Gong Yimo breathes a sigh of relief in her heart, but her face is still unconvinced. She sneered, "I can obey the decree." Seeing her like this, Emperor Qing sulks for no reason and hurriedly leaves. After the emperor leaves, Gong Yimo also stands up and walks towards the Imperial College's gate. The others are still kneeling on the ground, not daring to get up. Gong Dai is firmly pulled by Gong Yimo, his face flushed. "Royal sister, humph. Gong Yimo was infuriated for no reason. Before coming here, she had repeatedly reminded them to endure and not be in the limelight. At the same time, they had to be careful not to fall into other people's traps. Normally, Gong Dai's cleverness put her at ease. But today, it was such an obvious trap. Those people couldn't wait to blow things up, but Gong Dai still fell for it. This made her very angry, and she even suspected what had happened. Not only did he not appear for many days, but he also did something so unprofessional. Just like that, they reached the entrance. Gong Yimo said to him, "Go to Taiji Palace and wait for me." After saying those words, he gritted his teeth and kneeled down. Gong Dai remained silent as he knelt down beside Gong Yimo. "You can go back." Gong Yimo closed her eyes, somewhat tired. "At this time, you and I are at the heart of the struggle. Although it has been suppressed now, if you kneel like this, some people will make trouble again." Gong Dai's head is swollen, and he almost fainted. After hearing Gong Yimo's words, he sneered, "If I don't do anything, they won't make trouble." Gong Yimo swallowed. Seeing that Gong Dai is really uncomfortable, she secretly took out some fever medicine from her space and gave it to him. "Eat it." This is not the first time Gong Dai has taken it. He always knew that Royal Sister has good medicine that even the imperial physicians don't have, but he never asked, just like how he didn't ask where Royal Sister's martial arts came from. At this time, Gong Yimo was not idle. She beckoned the little eunuch beside Gong Dai and asked coldly, "What's the matter with His Royal Highness? Why didn't you call the imperial physicians? How did you serve him?" The little eunuch knelt down in fear and trepidation. Regardless of Gong Dai's cold eyes, he told Gong Yimo everything in full detail. The more Gong Yimo listened, the angrier she became. But in the end, she just silently let the little eunuch withdraw. She knelt there and sulked. Gong Dai also didn't know how to open his mouth. After taking the medicine, he only felt drowsy, but he has been holding on. The palace people passing by couldn't help but steal a glance at them. A man and a woman, too beautiful like Guanyin sitting down, were silent. One had a cold face, and the other was still angry. After Emperor Gong knew, he just sighed. Maybe he really thought too much. Therefore, with a wave of his hand, he pardoned Gong Yimo's punishment. When the two people returned to Taiji Palace, it was already evening. Gong Yimo didn't wait for Gong Dai. She walked in front of him and rushed into the inner hall. Gong Dai hesitated for a moment but also walked in. "Kneel." Gong Yimo, who was lying on the bed, suddenly said coldly. Gong Dai's heart trembled when he heard it. Because he was too afraid of the royal sister's disgust, he knelt down. The palace people who followed him couldn't help but sigh. Just now, the emperor roared at His Royal Highness to kneel, but His Royal Highness turned a deaf ear. But when the princess said that, His Royal Highness didn't resist at all. "Good, Gong Dai, you really grew up." Gong Yimo sat up and looked at him sadly. "Someone poisoned you, and you didn't tell me. You really are good." Gong Dai's face was quite ugly. "It's not a fatal poison. Aphrodisiac is also a poison. How old are you? That palace maid dared to poison you. Why did you have to go soak yourself in cold water? You even soaked for an entire night. What if you hurt your body?" The more she said, the angrier she became. "That girl took the initiative and laid naked on your bed. Why didn't you fulfill her wish? In the future, you can do whatever you want. Why torture yourself?" Gong Dai knelt on the ground and couldn't help but raise his head to look at her. Royal Sister said before that a good man should only marry one person. He said it so seriously, his eyes burning. Gong Yimo didn't know why her face heated up when he looked at her. Idiot! When she first taught him that, it was only because she thought of him as half an enemy. She hoped that he would walk the right path. But now that they were together day and night, she sometimes had the attitude of a parent towards Gong Dai. No matter what other girls did, her boy wouldn't suffer. The more she thought about it, the more guilty she felt. Gong Yimo patted her cheeks and muttered. Then why didn't you come to Taiji Palace for 5 days? When she asked this question, Gong Ju's heart felt as if it had been cut open. He thought of the words Sister Gong said at the Imperial College today. She said that she regarded him as a brother, a family member, and a good friend. She regarded him as her everything because he was the only one who lived with her in the cold palace. But if his mother didn't kill Xue Fei, Sister Gong would have countless confidants, siblings, teachers, and relatives. If she knew that she lost everything because of his mother, how sad would she be? The more he stayed silent, the more Gong Yimo felt that something was wrong. She asked the servant behind Gong Dai, "Where did His Highness go 5 days ago?" A servant saw that His Highness was kneeling on the ground and didn't say anything. He stepped forward and said, "His Highness finished class 5 days ago and went to Lu Xianfei's Hanxiang Palace." When she heard this name, Gong Yimo's heart jumped. So she said something. "That's why you're acting so strange." Really? Stupid. Chapter 29. Seeing Gong Dai's tacit agreement, Gong Yimo said resentfully, "How can you believe her words? She can't wait for you to die, don't you know?" Gong Dai closed his eyes, still silent. Gong Yimo became more and more angry, but at the same time, she was also a little sad. What did she say to make you alienate me like this? Her tone became more and more aggrieved. I thought that our hearts are connected, and our relationship is more than that of a brother and sister. I didn't expect you to be so easily instigated. You really hurt my heart. After saying that, she turned over and threw herself into the quilt, looking like she was really angry, and started to cry. Gong Dai panicked. He thought that maybe the royal sister would let it go for the sake of their many years of friendship. On the one hand, he was afraid that the royal sister would be angry, but in the end, he still wanted to believe the royal sister. After all, they had been together for so many years. So he sighed, "Royal sister, don't cry, I'll talk." As soon as he said that, Gong Yimo immediately sat up, and there was no trace of crying on her face. Gong Dai sighed slightly, and his heart relaxed a little. After everyone left, he told Lu Xianfei's words. After he finished, he didn't feel relieved, but instead felt more and more heavy, and this heavy feeling became more and more unbearable because of Gong Yimo's silence. "So, I thought that Lu Xianfei told you that my mother was killed by your mother, and that your mother died because of my mother, so you were worried that I would mind, and deliberately avoided me these days." Gong Dai felt the anger in the royal sister's tone, but he didn't speak. Xan. After a moment of silence, Gong Yimo suddenly shouted, and Xan quickly came in, looking at Gong Dai with pity, and whispered, "Princess. What orders do you have? Go and bring me my sword." Xan was shocked, and quickly kneeled on the ground. "Princess, you can't. If you have something to say, say it, say it. Say it. If I tell you to go, then go. Hurry up." Gong Yimo's sudden raised voice startled Xan. She looked worriedly at Gong Dai, who was equally shocked. She lowered her head and quickly took the sword. She weighed the sword in her hand and walked a few steps towards Gong Dai with her sword raised. She shouted angrily, "Raise your head." Gong Dai pursed his lips and raised his head slightly. His eyes were filled with unconcealable hurt. Was the royal sister going to kill him because of this? At the thought of this, Gong Dai's heart turned to ashes. He did not even have the will to resist. Even though he was stronger than Gong Yimo in terms of martial arts, he did not even have the strength to lift his hand. Gong Yimo raised her sword. Seeing him so dispirited, how could she not know what he was thinking? She became even angrier. This brat actually distrusted her so much. Come, show the palm of your hand. Quick, raise it higher. Gong Dai was originally waiting for her to chop down, but when he heard her words, he raised his head in astonishment. His hand unconsciously raised. Gong Yimo hurriedly raised her sword and slapped it down horizontally. Paw! It sounded very loud, but it was not very painful. However, Gong Dai seemed to have been hit silly and did not regain his senses for a long time. Seeing him in a daze, Gong Yimo slapped his palm again. This time, it was rather heavy. His palm turned red. Before Gong Dai could say anything, Gong Yimo started to cry. Royal sister. You! Gong Dai panicked and hurriedly got up to coax her. However, he was slapped away by Gong Yimo. She pointed at him and cried, "Go away. You bastard. We have depended on each other for so long. Don't you know what kind of person I am? You actually distanced yourself from me because of this. I'll beat you to death, you bastard." As she spoke, she raised her sword and slapped Gong Dai's body a few more times. However, it was as if she was patting dust. She could not bring herself to hit him too hard. Gong Dai's heart was in a mess, but he still managed to catch the main point at lightning speed. Royal sister. Don't you mind? Mind what? Your mother killed my mother. How old was I when my mother died? For so many years, the one who depended on each other was you, not her. Are you stupid? She angrily used her finger to poke Gong Dai's chest. Gong Dai kept retreating, still in a daze. Gong Yimo was depressed. In his previous life, he was not so conflicted. Hence, she said angrily, according to what you said, your mother died because of my mother. Should I also distance myself from you and cut off all contact with you? When she said that, Gong Dai was completely awake. No. Then that's it. After Gong Yimo finished speaking, she could not help but sigh. She looked at the handsome young man in front of her and her heart softened. Hence, she tiptoed to touch Gong Dai's head, who was already taller than her. There was a moment of melancholy in her eyes. Gong Dai, this palace is so big and there are so many people. However, how many people can really rely on each other? You and I are the closest people in this world. You should trust me. Trust me without hesitation. There's nothing more difficult than trust, but I trust you wholeheartedly. So, let's not talk about your mother killing my mother. Even if you bring me poison, I'll drink it because I believe that you won't harm me. So, why should I care about what happened to the previous generation? A person's life is already very difficult. If you can't see past it and let it go, then you reap what you sow. Her words revived Gong Dai's heart. That sentence, even if he gave her poison, she would not reject it. He could not help but think that if one day, Royal Sister really wanted him to die, he would gladly endure it. He must have been possessed. A small matter had troubled him for so many days. Now that it was resolved so easily, the large stone in his heart fell to the ground. He could not help but look at Gong Yimo's beautiful face. Once again, he felt lucky to have met her. How wise was she to be able to say such words? Sometimes, the intelligence that he was so proud of was not worth mentioning in front of her broad-mindedness. She spent her days lazily, laughing and laughing happily. She also had a clear understanding of the world. However, her pair of eyes were always so clear that one could see the bottom. This was probably returning to one's natural state. No wonder she was not diligent in practicing martial arts. Even with such a profound inner strength like the wind and rain, she could still make rapid progress. So what if he did not have a mother? It was enough for him to have such a special royal sister. Gong Dai could not help but recall what she said before. She said that she and he depended on each other in the cold palace, so he was forced to play many roles around her. However, he felt that she alone was enough to replace the image of everyone around him. So what if those princes had countless people around them? He believed that all those people added together could not compare to her alone. She was lively, colorful, and captivating. As for him, he was very happy and honored to be able to place so many roles around her. After Gong Yimo finished lecturing the child, she sighed in her heart. The child was still too insecure and cared too much about her. That was why he was so worried. Was her tone just now too harsh? Therefore, she tried to change the topic. "Oh right, what's up with that wooden figurine?" Speaking of this, she frowned slightly. Although she was not as sensitive as the ancient people, she was still worried. She was worried that Gong Dai would misunderstand her feelings for him because of their personal relationship. Chapter 30. As for him liking her, Gong Yimo had never thought of this possibility. Who would have such feelings for their elder sister, who was like a mother to them? He was not a pervert, and in Gong Dai's mind, she was his blood relative. This was not against the law in ancient times, so she did not think that Gong Dai would have any thoughts about her. As she spoke, she walked to the table to get the teapot. Xan saw this and quickly tidied up the table to pour tea for her. Gong Dai's heart was once again turned upside down. The difference was that before, it was because of despair, but this time, it was much more complicated. Fear, joy, bitterness, hesitation, he did not know how to tell the royal sister. Last night, the palace servant drugged him. After he felt that something was wrong, he quickly locked himself in the room. His mind was filled with her figure. Smiling sweetly, frowning, lazy and confused. Anne. When she was practicing martial arts, she was wearing a self-made simple dress, revealing her snow-white skin. When she pouted and lectured him, he felt that he was going crazy, so he soaked in cold water for a night. But he did not expect that the next day, he was still impatient and had a fever. So in order to concentrate, he started to carve. But what he carved was actually her appearance. He was panicked, surprised, and happy. Coincidentally, the 14th prince's words pierced his heart, and he maliciously slandered her. He could not bear it, so he used a heavy hand. Seeing that Gong Dai did not answer for a long time, Gong Yimo felt a little strange and turned her head. She saw that Gong Dai's expression suddenly became aggrieved. He opened his pair of cold dark jade eyes and asked, "Could it be that even the royal sister does not believe me? That wooden figurine. I originally wanted to give it to the royal sister." When he said this, Gong Yimo believed most of it, so she did not ask any more. She ordered the servants to bring food. After a day of torment, she was tired and hungry, and her mind could not work. Gong Ju endured the disappointment in his heart and secretly breathed a sigh of relief. He could not say it. If he said it, not only would Imperial Father not tolerate her, the world would also use the most malicious attitude to hurt her. This era was harsh on women, unless he had the power to suppress all public opinion, unless he became stronger. This thought had never been so strong. It was so intense that his entire body was trembling. Gong Yimo. Ah. Gong Yimo. Time was like a butcher's knife. 2 years had passed in the blink of an eye. Now, Gong Dai was 11 and Gong Yimo was 12. If there was one thing that people talked about the most in the past few years, it would be how the Chaoyang princess was favored. For some reason, the emperor suddenly doted on this princess from the cold palace. Even the crown prince paled in comparison. She liked to eat cold drinks, so ice cubes were prepared in the small kitchen of Taiji Palace all year round. She was not used to using a closed tub, so the palace built a sewer according to the blueprint she gave them. They also spent a lot of manpower to build a water tower and filter net in the palace. From then on, every palace had running water, which saved a lot of effort for the servants. There were countless things like this. Unknowingly, she also did a lot of good things. The sewer pipe was already in use in the capital. In order to be clean, the princess also came up with something like cotton paper, which was used exclusively in the toilet. She also improved the technique of making paper, which greatly facilitated the daily lives of students, not to mention things like movable type printing and hard pens. That little head seemed to have endless wonderful ideas. It was no wonder that the emperor doted on her so much. Even the common people were grateful to her. Shaoyang Palace Hall. Gongqing sat high on the dragon throne, listening to the ministers discuss matters with his body tilted. This was a place similar to a study, so everyone was not as strict as in the main hall. He sat down, not the crown prince or an important minister, but a princess. At this time, she was also sitting on a soft chair. Her movements were similar to Gong Chang's. How could a woman be present when a country was discussing politics? Many old ministers were dissatisfied, but some young ministers had already accepted this fact. They even felt that the emperor had restrained himself by not directly bringing the princess to court. At this time, they were discussing matters that couldn't be solved in court in Zhaoyang Palace. It was considered working overtime. Gong Yimo yawned listlessly, causing a group of old ministers to glare at her. Now they were discussing the annual drought in Shizhou and had no good ideas. Shizhou was a basin. Because there was no water source, the people there were very nervous about water, not to mention planting. Sometimes, the weather was not good, and even the most drought-resistant plants could not be harvested. Therefore, they needed the emperor's help 2 out of 3 years. It was an old problem. Everyone talked for a long time, but there was no good idea. Someone turned his eyes and glanced at Gong Dai. The land in Shizhou is barren, and the people suffer from wind and sand all year round. It is very difficult. Now that it is peaceful and prosperous, Jinshi of Gojoseon probably doesn't need so many soldiers. If half of the 100,000 soldiers and horses were taken back, the pressure on the court would be much less. Gong Dai heard this, squinted at him, and smiled coldly. At 11 years old, he was half a head taller than Gong Yimo. His eyes were cold and handsome, and his temperament was elegant. He had already grown into a fine young master. However, in the past 2 years, he listened to Gong Yimo's words and hid his strength. He gave people the impression that he was not good at anything except martial arts. He had mentioned the drought in Shizhou to the royal sister before. Ever since he met his cousin at the Empress Dowager's birthday, he had a close relationship with Jinshi of Gojoseon. Because of the geological problems in Shizhou, someone would use this as an excuse to take away his grandfather's military power. He had been worried about this before, but the royal sister's eyes lit up when she heard this. She said that it was an opportunity. Thinking of this, Gong Dai couldn't help but look at the sleepy girl. His eyes suddenly became gentle. The old minister's words were reasonable. They had to provide relief every year, and there was no war to be fought. It would be easier to have fewer people, so a few people agreed. However, this was only a temporary solution. Gong Che frowned slightly. He felt that this method had hidden dangers and was not feasible. At this time, the left prime minister stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, I think that Minister Pu's words are reasonable. Jinshi of Gojoseon has guarded Shizhou for many years, but he was helpless in the face of the drought. He must be old and can no longer bear this responsibility. It's time for him to retire to the capital." In his words, he pushed this problem that no one could solve to Jinshi of Gojoseon's incompetence. Asking him to retire to the capital was a nice way to put it. In Shizhou, Jinshi of Gojoseon deserved his reputation. If he really came to the capital, without military power, Jinshi of Gojoseon would be just an idle old man. At that time, not to mention protecting the family, it would be a good thing if he didn't suffer. The emperor knew this and didn't want to change people for the time being. However, he couldn't solve this problem, so he looked down at Gong Yimo. "My son, what do you think of this matter?" Seeing that the emperor asked the princess for her opinion on political affairs, many officials were unhappy. However, they had already punished the princess several times before, so now they just kept it in their hearts and didn't dare to say it out loud. Gong Yimo was about to fall asleep. When she heard the emperor's summons, she opened her eyes blankly and asked what was the matter. Chapter 31. But Gong Cheng was very patient. He first explained the geography of Shizhou, then said, "The minister of the left believes that Jinshi of Gojoseon has been guarding the border for many years, but he is helpless in the face of the drought. He wants me to replace Jinshi of Gojoseon. Some people also say that Shizhou has too many soldiers and horses and is useless. They want me to withdraw half of them." He bent over, as if he was whispering to Gong Yimo, but his voice was so loud that the entire palace could hear him. Many ministers' faces stiffened, and they were very embarrassed. After hearing the whole story, Gong Yimo blinked and tilted her head. At this time, she only had a tassel palace flower on her head. With this tilted head, the light green tassels drooped to one side, making her face look even fairer. Jinshi of Gojoseon is useless. 100,000 soldiers and horses are too many. He is helpless in the face of the drought every year. The more she spoke, the more she looked at everyone with contempt. She muttered, "This son thinks that the person who said this should be replaced. It's really brainless." Her words were very rude. The minister of the left sneered, "I don't know what brilliant ideas the princess has." Although he said that, he was sneering in his heart. Did she think that she could do whatever she wanted just because she developed some small things? What good ideas could a princess who had never even left the palace have? Unexpectedly, Gong Yimo patted her sleepy face and said softly, "Bring me a pen and paper." What they brought was the hard paper and the hard pen that Gong Yimo made herself. Before transmigrating, she had learned painting for a few years, so she was very familiar with simple drawings. With just a few strokes, she drew mountains and valleys on the paper. When Gong Cheng curiously leaned over to take a look, Gong Yimo had already finished drawing. Holding the sketch, she leaned over to the emperor and said, "Look, father. Father, please take a look. Does the terrain I drew resemble the West Continent?" Gong Cheng nodded, "It's more or less like that." Gong Yimo smiled and sat down on the half-empty dragon chair, saying loudly, "Both sides of Shizhou are snowy mountains. When the snow melts, there is plenty of water, but because of the special texture and hot climate, the water quickly dries up, so it is dry all year round, right?" The emperor didn't seem to mind that his dragon throne was occupied and nodded. "Why not dig a reservoir?" Ministers was sneered at the right time. "Princess, you may not know this, but there are hundreds of reservoirs in the West Continent. But after summer, all of them dry up." He had thought that the other party would have some brilliant ideas, but it seemed that it was nothing more than this. Gong Yimo smiled, looking at his expression as if she was looking at an idiot. "Why don't you connect the reservoirs?" Her words inspired everyone. Gong Che pondered and said, "Even if it's connected, it still can't escape the scorching sun, right?" Gong Yimo giggled and said, "Since the surface doesn't work, why not connect the underground? Won't the water source be preserved if the sun doesn't shine on it?" As she spoke, she once again raised the drawing in front of Gong Cheng, whose eyes were shining, and said confidently, "Dig a shaft at a suitable place in the middle of the mountain and connect the shaft to the reservoir from the underground. At the same time, dig the reservoir into the shape of a pot with a big belly and a small mouth. This way, when the snow melts, the snow water will flow into the shaft and then into the reservoir. Because it's all underground, the water source won't be lost. It should be enough for both human use and irrigation. Her words were clear and simple, but everyone present was enlightened and their eyes lit up. Gong Yimo saw this and added smugly, "This project is very vast, but once it is done, it will be done once and for all. It seems that 100,000 soldiers is still not enough. Jinshi of Gojoseon has been guarding the border for many years and already has prestige. It is most appropriate to let him coordinate and supervise the construction." "Father, am I right?" Gong Qing happily patted her head. "Everything my imperial son says is right. This matter is settled. My imperial son's advice is meritorious. Jin will reward you handsomely." Gong Yimo said with a smile, "If you really want to reward me, father, why don't you let me be an imperial envoy and personally supervise the construction in Shizhou? That would be interesting. I can't trust those fools if you give them to them. Don't mess up my good idea and blame it on me for not having a good idea." Gong Qing didn't feel embarrassed. Although he often did some unconventional things now, that was in the capital and no one dared to go against him. However, it was not certain in Shizhou. Sending a female imperial envoy would definitely cause trouble. So he shook his head and heartlessly rejected Gong Yimo. Sure enough, Gong Yimo pouted and blinked her watery eyes, very dissatisfied. Gong Qing hardened his heart and refused to look at her, his expression unquestionable. Gong Yimo sighed helplessly and settled for the next best thing. "Then father, send Gong Dai. He knows everything I know, so it should be appropriate for him to go. I don't believe in others." "Gong Dai." Gong Qing narrowed his eyes and looked at Gong Dai. Counting the time, his son was already 11 years old. In the past 2 years, he had been well-behaved and obedient, as if he had listened to everything Gong Yimo said. Most people would only remember the flamboyant and dazzling Gong Yimo and not him, who was like a shadow. When he thought about how Gong Dai didn't have a mother and no one to make plans for him, he didn't have a position and lived like an invisible person in the palace. Only his daughter would make plans for Gong Dai when he forgot about it. As for Gong Dai knowing everything, he subconsciously thought that it was just Gong Yimo's recommendation. Not only him, the other ministers also didn't believe that Gong Dai had any talent. When the time came, let him go out like this and come back with an official position. Gong Qing stroked Gong Yimo's head and thought. Anyway, in the past 2 years, although his son wasn't outstanding, he didn't make any mistakes. It was feasible, so he waved his hand and approved it. And the ministers didn't dare to go against what he had decided. They just secretly hated Gong Dai for having such a good royal sister. When she offered a good plan, she took advantage of the emperor's joy and recommended Gong Dai. This was a good job. If it was done well, it would be a good thing that would be passed down through the ages. But now, it was taken advantage of by others. "Thank you, Father Emperor, for your permission," Gong Yimo said obediently. When Gong Dai raised his head to express his thanks, she threw him a proud look. Gong Che saw it and was very envious. In the past 2 years, he had been very close with this royal sister. Every day by her side was very novel. Even if there was something unhappy, it seemed that as long as he saw her, it would disappear. She was so smart. Sometimes, when there were problems that he couldn't solve or couldn't figure out, as long as he asked her, she would be able to solve it. But unfortunately, no matter how close they were, in terms of closeness, royal sister still favored ninth brother. So every time he saw her protecting ninth brother, Gong Che always felt a little disappointed. But in the blink of an eye, he shook his head. He really shouldn't have, he was jealous of his sister-in-law. Soon, the emperor's decree spread everywhere. The matter had been finalized. In less than 7 days, Gong Dai would take the relief materials to the West Continent. Before leaving, Gong Yimo personally packed his luggage. She couldn't wait to give him all the good things. Gong Dai had never left her side. This time, he was going so far and for so long. To be honest, Gong Yimo was quite reluctant to let him go. But the child was raised and one day he would be independent. So, Gong Yimo tried her best to pave the way for him and suppressed all the reluctance. Chapter 32. Just as she was pacing around the palace, thinking of what else to prepare, Gong Dai walked in. With a wave of his hand, all the palace servants quietly retreated. It was common for the siblings to be alone. "Royal sister. You're here." Gong Yimo's eyes lit up. An 11-year-old youth already gave off a very mature feeling. In ancient times, he was considered a young adult at his age. At this moment, he was wearing white casual clothes, standing in front of Gong Yimo with his sword-like eyebrows and clear eyes. With this appearance, who knew how he would harm people in the future? Gong Yimo secretly nodded. She pulled him into the inner room and proudly handed him an item. "This is..." Gong Dai opened it to take a look. It turned out to be a golden silk soft armor. This soft armor was woven from golden silk and snowy mountain silk. It looked light and thin, but it could block swords and concealed weapons. It was a rare treasure. This year, Yu country offered this as a tribute. The emperor bestowed it to Gong Yimo, and she gave it to him. Gong Dai smiled and said, "I don't need it." "Why don't you need it?" Gong Yimo glared. 3 months ago, you were poisoned. 2 months ago, you were thrown off by a crazy horse in equestrian class. A month ago, your chest was almost cut open by a broken sword in swordsmanship class. Tell me, why don't you need it? Gong Yimo's expression became more and more desolate as she spoke. It was all because she didn't do well enough. She originally wanted to nurture him, but he was plotted against right under her nose. In these 2 years, Gong Dai didn't fight or snatch. He just lay low, but he was still an eyesore to some people. Even though Gong Yimo and he were vigilant, it was still impossible to guard against them. This harem was too big. Under the distortion of 30,000 women, every step was very difficult and dangerous. Therefore, after they discussed and plotted, they had the opportunity to let Gong Dai leave the harem. It seemed simple, but the thought that went into it couldn't be explained in a few words. Gong Yimo shoved the soft armor into Gong Dai's arms and said in low spirits, "I don't know when you'll come back after leaving. Take care of yourself." She looked at the young man who had grown into a handsome young man and thought bitterly, it wasn't easy to raise him into a well-educated and well-bred young man. Now that he's going to a high mountain and a long road, he won't have a wife when he comes back, right? She felt like an old mother, as if her cabbage was about to be eaten by a pig. Gong Dai saw that her mood was not high, and reached out to touch her eyes. In his eyes, there was a doting gentleness. "I'll be back soon." Because she was here, but when he came back, he didn't want to be the one who was protected by the royal sister. He would definitely make great contributions and stand in front of her to block all storms. As for her, all she needed to do was to be happy. Gong Yimo was embarrassed by his gaze. She also felt that the hand on her face was very wrong. She was clearly the eldest, but why did she feel like she was being pampered when a child looked at her? This was definitely an illusion. She slapped away Gong Dai's hand and continued to pack up her things. Speaking of which, the emperor had rewarded her with many good things, including a dagger that could cut iron like mud. She had to find it. Looking at the busy figure of the girl in front of him, that beautiful palace dress seemed to have flowers spun out. Gong Dai's lips gently curled up, he couldn't get enough of her. She had a pair of beautiful eyes. Although she often had a sleepy appearance, the laziness in her eyes often made him fascinated. She slept for 12 hours every day, and when she woke up, she was drowsy. But in front of him, she was lively and lively. Gong Dai couldn't imagine how a person could have so many expressions on their face, constantly changing in an instant. He really didn't want to leave her for even a moment. Gong Dai's smile gradually froze. If he could, he wanted to stay by her side like this. Just seeing her smile made him feel satisfied. But he was clear that if he didn't want to be protected by her for a lifetime, he could only fight and steal. Use his achievements to exchange for the right to stand by her side. In these 2 years, he had been studying and practicing martial arts every day. Moreover, he had been doing business with Gong Yimo and had shops all over the capital. But to outsiders, he could only suppress himself, as if he was invisible. This was not what he wanted. He wanted to have enough strength to stop suppressing himself and be able to stand in front of her openly. From her consciousness, he wanted to change from a boy to a man. He had too many thoughts, but he didn't dare to say them out loud. Some of his thoughts were even more twisted and terrifying, even he himself was shocked. He endured and hid it every day. He was afraid that if the royal sister knew his true thoughts, she would be afraid. Perhaps she would be disappointed. She had always hoped that he was an upright and determined person, not a crazy and twisted person. She didn't like him killing people, she didn't like his hands being stained with blood. So he needed to find a place to vent, to use killing to wash away the suppressed emotions in his heart. And in front of her, he would become whatever she wanted him to be. So even if he didn't want to, he had to leave. This was an opportunity that they had painstakingly planned, an opportunity to become stronger. Gong Yimo naturally didn't know that Gong Dai's heart was twisting and turning. At this moment, she was lying on the bed with her buttocks raised. She had no choice, she still had the habit of stuffing good things in the crevices of the bed. Gong Dai couldn't help but be attracted by her movements. That slender waist and perky buttocks. He closed his eyes and suppressed all the inappropriate thoughts, but he still couldn't control his eyes and greedily stared at her. Found it. Gong Dai happily held up 2 things, one was a book and the other was a dagger. When she saw the book, Gong Yimo's face changed, but thinking that Gong Dai couldn't understand the words on the cover, there was nothing to be ashamed of. After so many years, Gong Dai also knew that the royal sister had many books that he couldn't understand, but this book was especially strange. It used bright flowers and women as the cover, and the 3 words of the book title were written very brightly. It was completely different from what he had seen in the past. This is? Gong Dai asked subconsciously. Gong Yimo's face was slightly red, but she generously handed the book to Gong Dai. Anyway, he couldn't understand it, so it was impossible for him to know that it was an erotic book. It's just an ordinary travelogue. Usually, at this time, Gong Dai wouldn't ask about her secret, but her blushing face and her action of throwing the book to him was too abnormal. Gong Dai smiled faintly. Really? Gong Yimo nodded repeatedly. It was more real than a pearl. Just then, Gong Dai casually flipped through it and suddenly exclaimed, "Eh? There are illustrations in this book." When Gong Yimo heard that, she snatched the book back. There were illustrations. How could the illustrations in an erotic novel be serious? In the end, when she snatched the book to take a look, it was just a bunch of densely packed words with explicit descriptions. She accidentally read a few lines, and because she was in front of Gong Dai, her face couldn't help but burn. Bastard! He actually dared to lie to her. Gong Dai had a rough idea of what kind of book this was. He looked serious with a hint of confusion as he said, "Royal sister, why are you reading this kind of book?" He looked so innocent, and his eyes were cold as he looked at her with a pair of dark jade eyes. This look immediately deceived Gong Yimo, and she lowered her head guiltily. "I didn't read it. Gong Dai laughed in his heart, but on the surface, he raised his eyebrows slightly. Then who is it for? When Gong Yimo heard that, she raised her head. Of course it's for you to read. Seeing that Gong Dai was stunned, Gong Yimo felt that this was the case the more she thought about it. Now that you're 11, it's time to teach you some things between men and women. If he had a mother, then his mother would naturally instruct someone to teach him these things, but he didn't, so Gong Yimo took this responsibility on herself. Now that Gong Dai was at the age where he was ignorant, if he knew some things, then he wouldn't be easily fooled by girls outside. For me to read. Gong Dai was a little shy. Seeing that Gong Dai's face was red, Gong Yimo's spirits were lifted. Yes, come here. You're too innocent, your sister really needs to teach you what is between men and women. Between men and women, after all, Gong Dai was still a virgin, and Gong Yimo's initiative made his calm heart tremble. In a daze, he was pulled to the side of the bed to sit down. However, just as the words were about to come out of her mouth, Gong Yimo didn't know how to start. The two of them sat side by side, and the atmosphere was very awkward. Gong Yimo's body was slightly tense, she didn't know how to get out of this situation, but Gong Dai didn't want to let go of any chance to get close to her. It's like this, Gong Yimo thought for a while, then patted Gong Dai's shoulder seriously. You've grown up, and in a few years, you'll be at the age of marriage, so in these few years when you're away from home, you have to keep yourself clean, especially when it comes to girls. You have to be more careful and control yourself. Don't go out for a few years, you'll even have a child. What the hell was she talking about? Gong Dai was originally listening, but when he saw that she was getting more and more out of hand, he couldn't help but say with a cold face, I won't. He couldn't touch other women, much less have children. Gong Yimo saw that he didn't seem to care, so she joked to scare him, why not? You have to know that having a child is very simple. You just have to kiss the girl, and she'll get pregnant. Pregnant? Just as she finished speaking, Gong Dai suddenly leaned forward and covered her mouth that had been drooling for a long time. His heart stopped for a moment, and then it started beating rapidly. Chapter 33. Is it like this? Time seemed to have stopped. He could only hear his own heartbeat. The first time they touched, Gong Dai only tasted her lightly, but Gong Yimo was stunned. Looking at those moist lips, Gong Dai's Adam's apple bobbed. God knew how much effort he used to not let himself sink into it, but he was also afraid that he would cause her to be disgusted. Only after tasting her lightly did he separate. He opened his black jade-like eyes and murmured, like this. If kissing could lead to children, that would be great. If it was a normal prince without a mother and surrounded by eunuchs, even if he knew something, he would still be very innocent. However, there were too many people in the harem who wanted to lead him astray. Ever since a palace maid drugged him at the age of 9 and stripped herself to seduce him, he had personally read these books. He did not allow anything to happen that was beyond his control, and this was the same for matters between men and women. Therefore, in these few years, although he did not personally experience it, he had seen a lot of it. Later on, he also avoided many women's plots. However, he did not say these things. And Gong Yimo had long forgotten what happened to Gong Dai when he was 9. She thought that his growth was within her control, but she did not know that the coldness and purity were all a pretense. He had already grown up in a place that she could not see, and even developed an uncontrollable possessiveness towards her. Gong Yimo was stunned when she realized what had happened. She was actually kissed by the child she raised. However, looking at the curious look on his face, she could not say anything harsh. After a while, she found her voice again. Of course it's not just that. Gong Dai's eyes lit up. Then what else? Gong Yimo could only say bitterly, we also need to sleep on the same bed, be honest with each other, and then then success will follow naturally. God knew how difficult it was for her to say these words under Gong Dai's eager gaze. In short, in these few years outside, you have to keep yourself clean. Also, don't do what you did just now again, no one. The way she was stomping her feet made Gong Dai even more restless. He took a deep look at her, and then another, and then said in a low voice. I understand, royal sister. Gong Yimo, on the other hand, felt goosebumps all over her back from his last glance. The relief supplies were gradually being gathered. Many people would give Gong Dai a farewell gift for the emperor. When Gong Che came, he first came to Taiji Palace because everyone knew that Gong Dai was Gong Yimo's shadow. But this time, he came empty-handed. However, he was very happy to see Gong Yimo. It was evening, but the sky was still bright. Gong Yimo walked out excitedly with a few bottles of medicine in her hands. When she saw the brocade box in Gong Che's hands, her eyes curved. Brother Crown Prince, are you also here to give Gong Dai a gift? As she said this, she very intimately held his hand and walked out. Perfect, I'm also going. Let's go together. She seemed to be in a very good mood today. She was always only enthusiastic with Gong Dai, so she rarely took the initiative with him. Gong Che felt the warmth of her body close to him and his heart became slightly nervous. However, he couldn't bear to scold her and just let her drag him along. When they reached the outside of the palace, Gong Yimo paid attention to her image and let go of him. She curiously looked at the box in the other's hands. What did Brother Crown Prince give? Gong Che didn't avoid it and directly opened it for her to see. Inside was a dagger inlaid with jewels and pearls. It was very beautiful, but Gong Yimo knew at a glance that it was far less sharp than the one she gave. Wow, so beautiful. She praised from the bottom of her heart, Gong Dai will definitely like it. Yes, this thing was so valuable that it could be sold for a lot of money. Seeing Gong Yimo's expression of liking it, Gong Che's heart softened like water. He smiled and was about to say that he would definitely give her a better dagger in the future when Gong Yimo was already mesmerized by the blooming lotus flowers. With a soft cry, she ran over. She was so lively, her eyes always able to see the beauty that others overlooked. Gong Che looked over, just like this lotus pond. There were 8 lotus ponds in the palace, but looking at it now, he felt that none of the lotus flowers were as beautiful as this one. Pink and green, the bright sky against the gradually fading red clouds. Gong Yimo's lake blue palace dress jumped in. The dress fluttered in the wind like a butterfly fairy. Brother Crown Prince. Come over quickly, there are lotus seeds. Right now, the lotus seeds were still tender and small, but it didn't stop Gong Yimo from ruthlessly destroying them. With a light tap of her feet, she flew out like a swallow. With a flip, she plucked a lotus pod and landed on an unused willow leaf boat in the middle of the lake. As soon as she steadied herself, she smiled at him at the lakeside. Gong Che felt his heart stop. A smile that could topple a city, it was nothing more than this. Chapter 34. At this moment, the flowers and leaves lost their color. The world seemed to have become an enormous splash ink painting, and she was the only color. Gong Che pressed his chest. Recently, this strange feeling had become more and more frequent, so frequent that he would find all kinds of excuses to run to the Hogong, but he would instantly calm down when he saw her. But most of the time, as long as she took the initiative, that strange feeling would overturn and drown him, and it would take a long time for him to recover. Her foot tapped the bow of the boat, and the bow of the boat shot towards the shore like a sword. She stood at the bow of the boat, facing the wind. She was so elegant, as if she would be blown away by the wind at any moment. Gong Che felt this way. He looked at her without blinking, but saw the other smile sweetly at him. When the boat touched the shore, a group of palace servants from the Hall of Supreme Harmony met them and hurried over to bow. "Greetings to Your Highness the Crown Prince, Your Highness the Princess." The young eunuch at the front was called Yongfu. After he smiled and bowed, he said to Gong Yimo, "Princess is going to find His Highness the Ninth Prince." His Highness the Ninth Prince went to pick a war horse to accompany him, and hasn't returned yet. Gong Yimo didn't regret it and waved her hand to have him leave. Why was he gone for so long? She still had things to tell him. After he left, Gong Yimo looked at Gong Che and suddenly thought of something. Her brows rose again, and her bright eyes looked at the other. Is Crown Prince Gij busy returning to the Fu? The palace servant accompanying the Crown Prince wanted to speak, but the Crown Prince shook his head, no. Gong Yimo smiled, then is Crown Prince Gij willing to go sightseeing with me? She pointed at the small boat that was like a willow leaf. The lotus flowers in the lake are blooming beautifully. We can dive into the flowers and leaves to enjoy the scenery, wouldn't it be beautiful? The palace servant behind the Crown Prince saw that the boat could only hold 2 people. How could he guarantee the Crown Prince's safety? Just as he was about to refuse, he received a light glance from the Crown Prince. He lowered his head slightly and didn't speak. Seeing that he agreed, Gong Yimo was satisfied. She personally reached out her hand and bowed like a gentleman. When Gong Che saw that hand, he was slightly stunned. In the end, he subconsciously grasped that white and delicate hand and stepped onto the small boat. At this time, the boat swayed slightly. Gong Che couldn't stand steadily, and Gong Yimo held him tightly, standing in front of him, of strength. Gong Yimo didn't notice his abnormality. She just smiled and tapped her toes. The boat shot towards the center of the lake like a sword. At this time, the sky had already begun to darken, and large patches of clouds covered the sky. The two sat opposite each other, enjoying the gentle breeze. They were so comfortable that they almost fell asleep. There are flowers and water. How can there be no wine? The boat gradually steadied. Gong Yimo broke the silence with a smile. She took out a pouch from her sleeve. With a pop, she pulled out the wine cork. A mesmerizing aroma of wine wafted over. Gong Che knew it was the emperor's wine cellar that had been stored for 80 years. She impatiently raised her head and drank a mouthful. Her actions were natural and unrestrained. Her throat moved slightly when she swallowed, and the golden liquid that flowed down the corner of her mouth, under the fiery red clouds, mesmerized Gong Che's eyes. He even felt thirsty. At this time, Gong Yimo sighed, "Good wine." She wiped her mouth and slyly glanced at Gong Che. "This is the aged wine that I spent a lot of effort to steal from under eunuch Chang Shi's nose. How is it? Does Crown Prince Gij want to try?" At this time, as she spoke, the wings of the butterfly hair ornament on her head fluttered as if it was about to take flight. It was truly unparalleled. Looking at her small white jade hand that was holding the wine pouch, Gong Che mysteriously took it and unconsciously drank a mouthful. This wine was clearly for women to drink. It wasn't spicy, but it was mellow and fragrant. But this was what she had just drunk. They had shared the same wine pouch. This delayed reaction made Gong Che's face redden. He took another mouthful to cover it up before saying, "It really is good wine." Gong Yimo smiled faintly and rubbed her hands together. "Crown Prince Gij, there's a good saying. When you eat someone, you have to be soft-spoken. I, your imperial sister, kidnapped you onto this boat because I have something to ask of you." "Oh." At this time, Gong Che didn't pay attention to what she said. He only subconsciously responded, "What is it?" Seeing that he was direct, Gong Yimo also didn't beat around the bush. "To tell you the truth, in the capital, your imperial sister, although I have never left the palace, I have borrowed the hands of others and have many shops. Does your highness know?" Gong Che glanced at her, a little surprised. In reality, people like them had many assets. After all, there were many things that they needed money for. But Gong Yimo was a princess. Even if she was intelligent, she didn't have a consort mother to plan for her. Being able to have such foresight and put it into action, Gong Che couldn't help but look at her in a higher light. Gong Yimo frowned at this time and asked in a small voice, "That's the problem. Today, my subordinate reported that there's a strange matter around the capital. I'm sure that Crown Prince Gage has also heard about it." She raised her eyebrows slightly and continued, "Around last month, in the grain stores around the capital, the lowest grade rice, guliang, has been in short supply. Moreover, even old rice has been bought at a low price. The amount is so large that even if their actions are hidden, this little sister still noticed it." When she mentioned this matter, Gong Che's expression became serious. At first, he thought that this imperial sister of his had opened a few cosmetic shops at most. Even if she did, the business wouldn't be too big. However, this matter was only reported yesterday by his subordinate, and today, his imperial sister told him about it. It seemed that this imperial sister of his was quite capable and had a lot of assets. Gong Yimo was still smiling as he stared at her. Now that she was young, her smile was sweet and harmless. As time passed, fewer and fewer people remembered how fierce she was when they first met her. They only remembered how arrogant and spoiled she was now. They even let their guard down. It really shouldn't be like this. Seeing that Gong Che had digested this information, she slowly spoke again. It's common for Western Zhou to need disaster relief because of the drought. If someone was concerned and found out about it in advance and sent an urgent message, there would indeed be people in the capital who could make preparations in advance. In reality, this wasn't the first time. It was common for the disaster relief materials to be so demanding. The Daiyu state's territory was vast, so it took a lot of effort to manage it. Although the emperor was a wise ruler, he couldn't execute all the corrupt officials. Most of the time, as long as they didn't go overboard, he would turn a blind eye. However, this time was different. This was Gong Dai's first time in office, and it would affect his future. Moreover, Gong Yimo knew that this wasn't all. In order to target Gong Dai, those people not only tampered with the food, but also bought defective clothes and medicine. They wanted to pass off shoddy goods as good ones. Chapter 35. If Gong Dai, as a prince, went to Western Zhou with worse quality supplies than the previous years, it was easy to imagine what awaited him. What Gong Yimo wanted was for Gong Dai to use this opportunity to make a name for himself. She couldn't allow such a thing to happen. Therefore, Gong Yimo calmly said, "Brother Crown Prince knows that I have a good relationship with ninth brother. He lost his mother when he was young and had no one to help him. I'm the only one who can help him. This trip to the west was also planned by me. I want to train this young bird. Therefore, even if it's an unwritten rule to pass off shoddy goods as good ones, I won't allow it this time." At this point, her expression became serious and focused, causing Gong Che's heart to waver. In Gong Che's eyes, there was a sky full of red clouds. Her face was unquestionable, but her eyes were full of him. Being locked on by her, Gong Che knew that he couldn't refuse any of her requests. He couldn't help but think of his mother. She had done everything she could to make him the crown prince. Even so, he still felt pity and jealousy for the 11-year-old Gong Dai. "What does Imperial Sister want me to do?" Hearing his approval, Gong Yimo smiled again, causing the dissatisfaction that had just risen in Gong Che's heart to vanish. "In 3 days, Gong Dai will leave. Before leaving, they will check the supplies as usual, so they won't make a move. The only one who will make a move will be after leaving the city. Tomorrow, I will ask Imperial Father to use the excuse that there are too many supplies this time to leave the city from the east, south, and west gates at the same time. When the time comes, I will gather all the supplies at the south gate and leave." Her eyes flashed as she looked at Gong Che. "I heard that the lieutenant commander of the south gate is Brother Crown Prince's good friend. When the time comes, I want to borrow his troops to escort the supplies to Shirley Pavilion outside the city." After she finished speaking, Gong Che fell into deep thought. He knew in his heart that the other party did not necessarily trust him. Saying that he was leaving through the south gate might just be a smokescreen. However, he had thought about it carefully. For the sake of his reputation, Imperial Mother would not do anything to the disaster relief materials. Therefore, since Imperial Mother did not participate, he did not mind helping Gong Yimo. As he thought about it, he nodded in agreement. As expected, the moment he nodded, Gong Yimo's eyes curved into crescents. However, when Gong Che saw this, he did not feel happy for the first time. Instead, he felt annoyed and disappointed. He looked at the sky and could not help but think that this boat could not swim anymore. The more he thought about it, the more stifled he felt. Gong Che felt suffocated, so he stood up. Just as he was about to say, "Let's go ashore," he suddenly felt a jolt in his chest. His expression changed drastically. "Oh no!" Gong Che opened his mouth and wanted to call for help, but he remembered that the palace servants accompanying him were all on the shore, and Gong Yimo's people were also on the shore. Gong Yimo was originally happy to see him agree, but when she saw his face suddenly turn ashen, she couldn't help but ask. "What is it?" "Crown Prince Gidge." Gong Che did not say anything. He only used his hand to tightly cover his chest. This scene was very familiar. Gong Yimo was stunned and suddenly woke up. In her previous life, she had been by Gong Che's side for so long. How could she not know of Gong Che's greatest secret? She also knew that the people who knew of this secret were either his trusted aides or dead. The small boat suddenly became silent. Gong Yimo did not even have the time to sigh at her bad luck. Her back straightened and a thin layer of sweat appeared on her forehead. At this time, Gong Che finally let out a soft cry and suddenly sat down. He held on to the edge of the boat and gasped for breath. His face was a frightening purple and he could no longer maintain his gentle image. Instead, he looked nervously and vigilantly at Gong Yimo. There was actually killing intent in his eyes. His secret could not be known by anyone. In this world, there were no more than 5 people who knew that Gong Che had a hidden illness. When the Empress was pregnant, she had unfortunately been poisoned and gave birth to Gong Che. At first, it was fine, but as he gradually grew up, the Empress discovered that his heart and lungs were damaged. He would often suffer from suffocation and colic, and his life was in danger. This was originally a big matter, but the Empress had suffered a hemorrhage when she gave birth to Gong Che. After she woke up, she was told that she could no longer get pregnant. A prince with an illness could not become the crown prince, so she hid this news. Those who knew were either killed or kept quiet. Finally, the emperor and the concubines didn't know about it. Therefore, his mother repeatedly warned that for his position as the crown prince and his family's honor, those who knew about this matter could only die. At this time, Gong Che was very regretful. He really did not think that his hidden illness would act up so early. His medicine was with the palace servants on the shore. He tightly covered his chest and looked at Gong Yimo with a complicated expression. Everyone who saw him like this had to die. And he was going to kill her. At this time, the little boat was already in the middle of the flowers. It was covered by the lotus leaves, so the people on the shore could not see the two of them. If he wanted to kill someone, this was the best chance. Gong Che made his decision in an instant. He turned his palm and a small hidden weapon appeared in his hand. The little boat slowly swayed. He wanted to kill her in the time the boat swayed. Kill her, and then send a signal for his confidant to save her. He had to kill her. Large beads of sweat fell from his pale face. He forced himself to open his eyes. His body was tense to the point of suffocation and gradually became numb. The moment the little boat swayed into the flowers, Gong Yimo knew that she could not hesitate any longer. She nervously looked at Gong Che. She saw that Gong Che was holding his chest that was becoming more and more suffocating. The other hand was holding the thing that wanted her life, but he did not move. He was hesitating. That's great. Gong Yimo's mind quickly turned. As for Gong Che, he was holding the hidden weapon, but he could not bring himself to do it. When he thought of killing her, the first thing he thought of was not how to explain it to Imperial Father or how to deal with the people on the shore who might have seen him like this. Instead, he could not explain it to himself. Did he really want to kill her? He had never been a gentle person. For the sake of status and Imperial Mother, he could kill someone without batting an eye. But, did he really want to kill her? Seeing Gong Che's face become more and more ashen, Gong Yimo immediately raised her hand and walked towards him. When she moved, Gong Che could not help but tense up. He almost pressed the hidden weapon in his hand. Don't come over. His eyes flashed with a trace of reluctance. A drop of sweat fell from Gong Yimo's forehead. She gently said in the least provocative tone. Crown Prince Gij, put down the chi box in your hand. When Gong Che heard this, his eyes suddenly widened. The chi box was the small box in his hand. As long as he pressed it, the poisonous gas inside could be seen and blood could be seen. Other than him who had taken the antidote, everyone else would die without a doubt. How did she know? While he was hesitating, Gong Yimo had successfully walked to his side and quickly said, because of the problem with the cultivation method, I already knew about Crown Prince Gij's secret. She forced a smile and pressed Gong Che's hand that was holding the chi box. Her eyes were calm and serious as she said, but this matter, I did not tell anyone, including Gong Dai. Chapter 36. With just this sentence, Gong Che, who was about to fall into a coma, suddenly loosened his grip. While speaking, Gong Yimo hurriedly laid Gong Che, whose body was already numb and had no strength to think, flat on the small boat. As the night gradually darkened, Gong Che could not see her expression clearly. He let her do whatever she wanted. His thumb kept pressing the button, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not press it down. Gong Yimo's back was tense, but her hands did not stop, as if she did not see anything. She held his neck with one hand, raised his chin, and pressed on his chest with the other hand. Her voice was serious and firm, with a certain kind of determination. Everything I'm going to do next is to save you. If you want, you can press the button at any time, but just once is enough. Brother Crown Prince, you can try to believe me this once. You know that I, Gong Yimo, will never disappoint anyone. Yes, she would never disappoint anyone. She would never disappoint anyone. As she spoke, she took a deep breath and closed her eyes abruptly. Then, she bent down towards those pale and purple lips. The moment their lips touched, both of them trembled. Gong Che could not help but widen his eyes. His originally unfocused gaze suddenly focused. His thumb wanted to press down several times, but it froze again and again. Could she believe him? This was a matter of life and death, status, and family. Could he believe her? But in just a moment, he felt a long breath enter his body. The suffocating feeling that he had to take medicine gradually subsided, but his heart was still beating fiercely, and his face was purple and red. Gong Yimo changed her breath and kissed him again. This time, she felt more clearly. Gong Che's lips were very soft, very soft. It reminded her of the cotton candy she used to eat in the past. Gong Che only felt the girl's body fragrance and the surrounding lotus fragrance enveloping him. Between his lips and teeth, the lingering sweetness brought with it the fragrance of the wine that they drank together just now. It was intoxicating. Gong Che's fingertips trembled, as if he was in a dream. Gong Emo breathed a sigh of relief. At the same time, her other hand was pressing on his chest, continuously pushing and guiding his internal energy, hoping that he would feel better. At this moment, her expression was focused, and her long eyelashes were trembling. However, her back was stiff and cold. She didn't know if what she was doing would be of any use to Gong Che's situation. As long as Gong Che pressed down lightly, she would lose her life. Gong Che was not as gentle as he appeared to be. Gong Yimo knew this better than anyone else, so she was taking a gamble. She hoped that Gong Che would not kill her for the sake of their past relationship. Her inner energy flowed into Gong Che's body like it was free of charge. At this moment, the curtain of the night had slightly darkened. A drop of sweat slid from Gong Yimo's face to Gong Che's face, causing the originally semi-conscious Gong Che to tremble and actually open his eyes. His numb limbs seemed to have recovered, and his senses became even sharper. Looking at the face in front of him that was so close, their lips intertwined, he suddenly had an impulse. His eyes flashed with a trace of confusion. He seemed to be better. After confirming that all of this was real, his heart hesitated. She was not immortal, right? Gong Che looked at her with infatuation. That warm drunkenness filled the air. He knew that he shouldn't sink into it, but he couldn't stop himself from sinking into it again. Her lips were so fragrant and soft, as if they had gently bumped into his heart, causing his originally suffocating heartbeat to crazily beat again. No. They were brother and sister, how could they do this? But so what if they were brother and sister? The little boat floated on the lake. Because they had drifted into the depths of the lotus flowers, the sweet fragrance of the lotus flowers filled the air. Gong Yimo's wine bag had unknowingly spilled, and the entire boat was filled with that intoxicating smell. Gong Che looked behind her in a daze. Clumps of lotus leaves stuck close to them. He only needed to reach out his hands to pluck them, and they were doing this kind of thing under the flowers and leaves. From his angle, the sky had been cut open by the leaves. At this time, the sunset had turned into a thick purple, and a few stars dotted the inky blue sky. It was so beautiful that it could consign people to eternal damnation. Gong Yimo felt Gong Che gradually calm down, and she slowly got up. But when she got up, Gong Che lightly licked her, startling her and causing her to sit up straight. She kept getting up, and the lotus leaves hit her body, causing her to have no choice but to bend down again. Once again, she was very close to Gong Che, and their breaths were intertwined. How could he be like this? Gong Yimo bent down with one hand on the wooden plank, not daring to look at him. She couldn't even say, "Are you better?" in this kind of ambiguous situation. Gong Che was also shocked by his wild behavior, and for a moment, he was speechless. At this time, the boat suddenly moved and swayed out of the narrow channel. Gong Yimo immediately sat up, and the people on the shore were already waiting anxiously. Her body tensed up, and she couldn't help but sit back. Seeing Gong Che in a daze, she secretly glanced at the box in his hand. Probably. She should be safe. Just now, for a moment, she was really afraid that after Gong Che recovered, he would suddenly kill her to silence her. But looking at his silent appearance, it seemed like he didn't have that intention. But just in case, she hurriedly used the last of her remaining inner strength to push the boat to the shore. When the bow of the boat reached the shore, Gong Yimo heaved a sigh of relief, and the slight vibration also woke Gong Che up from his dream. He subconsciously looked at Gong Yimo, and his face suddenly turned red. Unfortunately, the night was dark and others couldn't see anything clearly. He hid the chi box in his hand, and without saying goodbye, he hurriedly climbed out of the boat and left in a sorry state. Although the people accompanying the crown prince felt that it was strange, in the end, they only looked at Gong Yimo suspiciously, and then saluted and chased after him. Seeing that the group of people had left, Gong Yimo heaved a long sigh of relief. Damn it, I almost died. Fortunately, she was quick-witted. God, how could she think of such a stupid idea like artificial respiration? Gong Yimo kept a straight face, but in her heart, she was despising herself. She could have just used her internal guidance. In the end, she concluded that it was because she was too nervous at the time, and her brain didn't think much of it. Now, she could only pray that Gong Che didn't mind this matter, and she still needed his help in a few days. Thinking of this, she turned around and found Gong Dai standing straight behind her in the night. He was dressed in black, and his hair was covered in mist. She didn't know how long he had been standing there. For some reason, Gong Yimo felt that there was something wrong with the current Gong Dai. His figure was elongated by the palace lantern. He was clearly expressionless, but Gong Yimo could see loneliness from him. It was as if he was isolated from the world, and also as if he was in deep pain. Gong Yimo slightly frowned, and looked at Exayan, and the others who were silent like cicadas in winter. You came to find me. How long have you been here? Why didn't you let anyone warn me? It had to be known that if Exayan, called out from the shore, she would definitely be able to hear her. At this time, Gong Ju fixed his eyes on her. At this time, he was only 11 years old. He was still a teenager, but his eyes seemed to contain thousands of words. They were like a mass of thick ink, sucking people in. He reached out and suddenly grabbed Gong Yimo's hand. At this time, her hands and feet were very cold because of the overdraft of internal energy. A steady stream of internal energy came from the palm of his hand. Gong Yimo raised her head in surprise, but the other party only lowered his head and said indifferently, "In the future, don't meet the crown prince alone." Chapter 37. Gong Yimo found it strange that they couldn't draw a clear line between themselves and the crown prince. Gong Dai suddenly reached out with his other hand, and patted her head. At this moment, he was much taller than Gong Yimo, but how could he do something like patting her head? Gong Yimo was about to explode, but when she looked up, she saw Gong Dai's dark jade-like eyes filled with grief. How can I stop Royal Sister from running around for me? Whether it was thinking of ways to earn money, planning, or worrying about him, it was fine. Clearly, I only want Royal Sister to be happy. Clearly, he only wanted to protect her, love her, and then see her happy and carefree. He didn't want her to be like now, constantly worrying and scheming. Gong Yimo's hair was soothed, and she said with a smile, "I'm happy now too." Her expression didn't seem fake, as if worrying for him was a happy thing. At this moment, Gong Dai really wanted to hug her tightly in his arms. He wanted to hug her, kiss her forehead, and merge her into his flesh and blood. So what if they were blood relatives? So what if everyone was talking about them? He wasn't afraid of anything. But when he raised his hand and put it down, the youth's mood was extremely conflicted. But what do I have? This sentence suddenly flashed through Gong Dai's mind. What right do I have to hug her? The wind seemed to suddenly turn cold. Gong Dai looked at her, his eyes surging, but he put his hand down heavily. He sighed slightly. No rush, no rush. He didn't have the right now, but he would in the future. It was okay to endure, he wasn't afraid of waiting, as long as she was here. Gong Yimo saw that he was worried, an expression that shouldn't appear at his age, and couldn't help but frown. Then, she lowered her head and touched her stomach. I wanted to send you something before going back for dinner, but I didn't expect it to be so late. You haven't eaten, right? Why don't we give you special treatment? The more she spoke, the more spirited her eyes became. Gong Dai looked at her. After a while, he sighed as if he was defeated. His eyes were filled with helplessness and love. He pursed his lips and smiled. All right. This time, because Gong Dai was going to the West Continent for disaster relief and the important task of building wells and canals, there were more craftsmen, sailors, and other skilled people accompanying him. Because of the scale of this project, the amount of materials needed was more than twice as much as before. Therefore, when Gong Yimo proposed that the three sects work together, Gong Qing agreed with a wave of his hand. But this thought made those who wanted to make a move anxious. Time was of the essence, and they did not have enough manpower. There was no way for them to ambush 3 doors at the same time. What was originally a simple task had become complicated. They could only take a gamble. A masked man said to the leader, "Time is tight now. It is said that there are 150 carriages in each of the 3 roads, but we have limited people. We can only block one of the 3 gates. I hope you can make a decision soon. Otherwise, we won't be able to explain ourselves if something goes wrong." 150 carriages in each of the 3 sects. Where did they get so many things? Didn't they say that there were only 150 carriages in total? Did those fellows from the Ministry of Revenue make a mistake? The leader was anxiously talking to himself. After a subordinate hurriedly came to report, he calmed down. It turned out that the Crown Prince had just issued a secret order for the gatekeepers guarding the central gate to be on standby. When the materials left the city, they were to send troops to protect them. Although he did not know why the Crown Prince wanted to help the 9th Prince, the Crown Prince's actions showed that the materials were not sent out of the city in triplicate. They were still in one place. So now it was a problem of choosing one of the 3. Was it the South Gate that the Crown Prince ordered to protect, the East Gate as originally planned, or the inconspicuous West Gate? He pulled his beard and pondered. This time, the 9th Prince was ordered to leave the capital by the Chaoyang Princess. The Chaoyang Princess was an intelligent person. If she had thought of this idea, then which road would she take? He could not guess the thoughts of a little girl. The official waved his hand and said to his subordinate, "The Chaoyang Princess is treacherous. This time, the materials will definitely be gathered in one place. Now that they have set off, quickly go and check which road has the heaviest traces of the carriages and report back." The subordinate's eyes lit up when he heard this. He hurriedly went and returned in a short while. He panted slightly and hurriedly said, "There is a result. This matter is indeed strange. The tracks at the West Gate are the deepest, followed by the East Gate. The tracks at the South Gate are the shallowest." The official narrowed his eyes and pondered for a moment before smiling. The little girl is indeed astute. Unfortunately, she met this old man. His expression turned serious. "Tell everyone at the East Gate not to move. The materials will definitely come out from the East Gate. Do not fall for their trick." The man in black was puzzled. "Sir, why do you say so?" The old man proudly stroked his beard and said, "The tracks are the deepest. The princess must have filled them with sand and stones to confuse the public. The tracks at the South Gate are the shallowest. Did the things on the carriages disappear into thin air? Only the East Gate, the most dangerous place, is the safest. The Chaoyang Princess did the opposite. She is quite clever." Seeing that he was so certain, the man in black smiled and flattered. "Unfortunately, sir still saw through it." The official laughed. "Quickly go and do it. The Chaoyang Princess originally wanted to divide our troops, but I saw through her. You must seize the opportunity." Yes, sir. After the man in black left, the official was still leisurely. Those barbarians of Western Zhou only have some rotten grain and old rice. Humph, Your Highness, I hope you will accept this gift. Shirley Pavilion. The fleet of carriages approached from afar. There were at least tens of thousands of people. A group of soldiers and horses escorted the carriages to Shirley Pavilion and returned to the south gate to report. At this time, Gong Dai ordered everyone to start reorganizing the carriages. He looked forward and saw a person in white sitting in the pavilion. Obviously, he had been waiting for a long time. He raised his eyebrows and quickly galloped over. Gong Yimo was originally drinking wine. When she heard the sound of the horses, she quickly took out a teapot from her space and pretended to sip tea. Gong Dai approached and smelled the faint smell of alcohol. He did not point it out and instead smiled. According to the law, a prince could not leave the capital without an imperial decree. Now that he was standing here, he felt his body and mind lighten. He no longer needed to hide. His depression was swept away and he became high-spirited. Gong Yimo saw the joy in his eyes when he galloped over. It was something she had never seen before. In the palace, he was frighteningly quiet. Now, he had the demeanor of an 11-year-old boy. Gong Yimo secretly nodded at her decision. The sadness of the impending departure was also reduced. Royal sister. Gong Yimo smiled. How was it? Did the journey go smoothly? Chapter 38. Gong Dai nodded his head. How could it not be successful? Out of the 150 horse carriages, the royal sister had left the last 20 or so empty, and she had done something to them. A row of willow branches had been tied to the crossbar in front of each of the 20 horse carriages. Because of the cover, if one did not look carefully, one would not be able to see the strangeness under the wheel of the horse carriages. Therefore, when the horse carriages in front passed by, the bamboo leaves under the last 20 empty horse carriages would cover the road, and then leave the tracks of the empty horse carriages. The observers only dared to go forward to check after the horse carriages had passed, and the result would be that the horse carriages were empty. This was easy to say, but difficult to do. The crossbar with the willow branches could be moved up and down. There was a small switch, and only by pressing it would the willow branches fall down. Otherwise, it would be retracted. Therefore, when the horse carriages were inspected outside the palace, nothing could be found. Gong Yimo had prepared for this little scheme for half a year. Therefore, the one who had planned for a long time was not the corrupt officials who had prepared the shoddy goods a few months ago, but Gong Yimo. For this opportunity, she had prepared for more than a year, contacted the emperor, the crown prince, and bribed the officials of the Ministry of Revenue. She had really calculated everything. Gong Dai sat opposite her, took the tea prepared for him, and drank it in one gulp. The royal sister had always treated him as a child who could not drink alcohol. However, every time she secretly drank, he could only sigh. No matter what she thought, this journey to the West Continent was long and difficult. When he returned, whether she admitted it or not, he would be an adult. He believed that when he returned, he would definitely make the royal sister unable to treat him as a child. He personally poured a cup of tea for Gong Yimo, and his somewhat cold eyes lowered. Since there is no farewell wine, I will use tea in place of wine. This first cup is for royal sister. Seeing Gong Yimo looking at him, he smiled again. His originally cold eyes were so bright, but they were so dazzling. He looked deeply at Gong Yimo, as if she was the only person in the world. Thank you, royal sister, for plotting for me all these years. Every little thing, every day, every fall, was not bestowed by the heavens, but by you. So, this toast is to royal sister, to thank royal sister for giving me a second chance at life. As he spoke, He used tea as a substitute for wine and drank it all in one gulp. Gong Yimo also drank it. After drinking it, she propped up her chin and listened to what he was going to say next. This second toast is to the royal sister. He looked deeply at Gong Yimo again, but his expression was slightly intoxicated, as if he wanted to remember her face in his heart. All these years, I've been a burden to royal sister, he laughed self-deprecatingly. I have nothing, but royal sister did everything for me. So, this second toast is to thank royal sister for not giving up. Gong Yimo was moved by his words. Memories of the past appeared in her eyes. She sighed. So time passes so quickly. It's time for you to spread your wings and soar. After saying that, she was incomparably melancholy. Gong Dai poured the third cup of tea. At this time, the joy in his eyes gradually dissipated, leaving only the reluctance buried deep in his heart. But he couldn't back down, just for the right to stand side by side with her. This third toast. He hesitated. His white jade-like fingers rubbed the edge of the cup, and he finally sighed. This Shirley pavilion was quiet and isolated. It had witnessed too many farewells, but Gong Dai hated the word farewells. He hated it very much. He smiled weakly. A trace of misery appeared on his youthful face. He raised his cup again and said to Gong Yimo, "This third toast is to the royal sister again." His eyebrows were cold, but his eyes flickered slightly. I've imagined countless times what I would be like if you weren't in the cold palace. I would definitely be cruel and twisted. I would definitely be violent. This world would definitely be lonely and hopeless. So, this toast is to you. Thank you for existing in my life. He didn't finish his last sentence. His tone contained too many emotions, which made Gong Yimo puzzled. How could there be so many indescribable emotions in the clear eyes of the youth in front of her? He had never said so much before, but when he said it, every word came from the bottom of his heart. It was getting late. Looking at the fleet of carriages that were ready to leave, a trace of determination appeared on the youth's face. At this time, he had already put down his teacup and walked in front of Gong Yimo. He was already so tall. Gong Yimo sighed softly. She saw him reach out, looking like he wanted to hug her. Gong Yimo closed her eyes slightly. If hugging the youth could make this journey less lonely, then she would hug him. But after waiting for a long time, she only felt him pick up a strand of her hair, and then use his inner strength to break it. He really wanted to hold her in his arms. He raised his hand and put it down. That kind of strong desire was almost swallowing him up. However, he had restrained himself for a long time. He didn't want to fail at the last moment. So, he took a strand of her hair and lowered his head to whisper in her ear. "Momo, wait for me to come back." After saying that, he didn't wait for Gong Yimo to raise her head in surprise. He quickly got on his horse and left. Gong Yimo touched her hair. Her eyes were slightly stunned, but soon, it was covered by the yellow sand. On the back of the horse, the youth touched the hair on his chest, and a bitter smile appeared on his face. She would never know how painful parting was for him. On one hand, he had the happiness of standing behind her, and on the other hand, he had the ambition of standing by her side. Both were like opium poppies that made people sink, but he chose the latter. That day, only he had seen the joy and panic in the Crown Prince's eyes when he left. He knew what that meant, because he had experienced the same moment of hesitation, and had experienced the same feelings of struggle. Therefore, he was duty-bound to not turn back. If he became the Crown Prince, he could gain her favor. If he became an important minister, he could become someone she could rope in. If he became the emperor, he could gain her dependence, he could do it all. When he stepped out of the imperial city, Gong Dai reined in his horse and looked deeply in that direction. "Royal sister, wait for me to come back." Not to mention how smoothly Gong Dai's journey went, but inside the imperial palace, there was a storm of blood and a conspiracy brewing. When she found out that Gong Dai's team had successfully left the city, and that the crown prince had ordered them to escort them, the empress was furious. At this time, the crown prince knelt in front of the empress with a serious expression. Phoenix Palace was cold and the air seemed to be condensed. The empress didn't even look at the crown prince in front of her. She rubbed her forehead, obviously very angry. At this time, there were only two confidants in the hall. At this time, one of them lifted the curtain and whispered something in the empress's ear. The empress's phoenix eyes widened, and looked at her fiercely. "Your Highness, please spare my life." She quickly knelt on the ground, lamenting her bad luck. "Spare your life?" she sneered, and the phoenix coronet on her head reflected a chilling light. "Each and every one of you can't do anything right. How did this empress raise you all? Someone come. Drag her out and execute her." Chapter 39. Yes. Immediately, the imperial guards came in and dragged the kneeling palace maid out with a gag. The remaining two confidants in the room trembled and didn't even dare to breathe. "If mother is angry, just take it out on your son. Why do you have to involve other innocent people?" The crown prince had been kneeling for a while and spoke for the first time. The empress' sharp eyes suddenly locked onto him. "You think mother doesn't dare? Tell me, what did that little bitch Gong Yimo feed you to make you help her to this extent?" When Gong Che heard this, he raised his head and looked at her. This son wants to know why imperial mother is so angry over this matter. His words made the empress choke. Seeing her dodge, Gong Che couldn't believe it. "Mother is confused. Do you think we can touch the relief supplies?" His accusation made the empress angry. "Since others can touch it, why can't I? As my son, how can you not understand my difficulties? Do you know how many resources are needed to take care of all this? In terms of birth, my mother's family is declining and can't compare to concubine Li Xian. In terms of favor, I can't compare to concubine Long. My position as empress is precarious. If I don't plan, I will be replaced sooner or later. What's wrong with me? But you can't touch the relief materials." Gong Che's expression gradually became anxious. The significance of this trip to the West is far greater than before. In order to solve the problem of the drought in the West Province once and for all, Father is determined this time. If it wasn't for the importance, do you think he would have allowed the Chaoyang princess to come out? If it wasn't for the importance, do you think Father would have turned a blind eye to the Ministry of Revenue's extra 300 carriages? It's fine if you didn't succeed this time. If it had succeeded, Mother wouldn't have been able to punish me now. His words were like a heavy hammer that struck the Empress hard. She slumped onto the phoenix couch, her eyes filled with panic. "Are you speaking the truth? Does your father really value this matter that much?" Gong Che nodded. "When the Chaoyang princess told me about this, I didn't give the order without thinking. She's a woman who's never left the palace, but she sensed the movements in the capital a few months ago and even came to me for help. She must have received Imperial Father's tacit approval, so I went with the flow and helped her. I originally wanted to gain a favor, but I didn't expect this strange movement and Imperial Mother's involvement. Why didn't you tell me?" The Empress became flustered and evasive. How can I let you interfere in this matter? You are the Crown Prince. But, if it's really as you say, what should we do now?" The more she thought about it, the more frightened she became. Her forehead was covered with cold sweat. The Empress was like a bird that was startled by the twang of a bow. Although she had failed to achieve her goal, as long as her plan was exposed, Imperial concubine Long and Imperial concubine Lu Xianfei would not let go of this opportunity to attack her. The more the Empress thought about it, the more scared she became. Cold sweat kept falling from her forehead. Seeing her like this, Gong Che couldn't bear it and softened his voice. "Mother, don't be afraid. This matter will be done, nothing will happen. If it was just ordinary corruption, as long as there was no one behind it, there shouldn't be a problem." Thinking of something, Gong Che hurriedly said, "This matter is of great importance. Now that ninth brother has successfully left the capital, Mother should quickly withdraw the people to avoid exposing the truth." Hearing Gong Che's words, the Empress's eyes gradually regained their spirit. You're right. Seeing Gong Che still kneeling on the ground, she personally helped Gong Che up and said with shame, "This matter is Mother's fault. Mother didn't want you to be involved in these trivial matters, so I didn't tell you. It's Mother's fault." As she spoke, her phoenix eyes were filled with tears. She really regretted it. In the end, she did all this for him. Gong Che thought about it and his heart softened. He comforted her again and again, "Mother, don't be afraid, nothing will happen." But he didn't know why he felt uneasy. Sure enough, when the Empress asked her trusted female official to inquire about the situation, a guard hurried over. The news he brought made the Empress's heart turn to ashes. How could it be? It's over. Her heart was beating like a drum. She could only blame her cousin for thinking that he was smart and didn't withdraw in time when he saw the abnormal situation. It turned out that other than the South Gate, the carriages in the East and West Gate were actually the Emperor's imperial guards. As one could imagine, when a group of black-clothed people wanted to take advantage of the situation and take advantage of the shoddy goods, the imperial guards that came down from the carriages scared them out of their wits. They obviously received the Emperor's secret order to capture the leader alive and kill the rest. So they didn't have time to come back and report to the Empress because they were already on the road to the Netherworld. The Empress fell to the ground. All of this was most likely a conspiracy. First, they instigated the Liu family to move the relief supplies. Then, they informed the Emperor. Otherwise, how could they explain the Emperor's early preparation and then a thunderous strike? Who was it? Who instigated behind the scenes and forced her to a dead end? Gong Yimou. Impossible, that little bitch didn't have such means. The Empress couldn't help but think of Gong Che's words that the Ministry of Revenue had an extra 300 silver carriages. The Ministry of Revenue. Imperial concubine Long. Cold sweat covered the Empress's forehead. She panicked. She didn't expect that a simple disaster relief would be aimed at her death. That woman, Long Xiangxiang, didn't make a move, but once she did, she was so decisive. It was all over now. Gong Che was also shocked by the news. He was only thinking about who was so greedy this time and whether or not the Emperor would catch them, but he didn't expect it to be his mother. And this was obviously not an ordinary case of corruption, but a conspiracy that had been planned for a long time. At this time, he closed his eyes and turned to walk out of the palace. Where are you going? At this time, the Empress' hair was a little messy. Her confidant hurried to help her. She staggered a few steps forward and grabbed Gong Che's sleeve. Gong Che didn't even turn his head. I'm going to confess to my father before he acts out. No. The Empress screamed. You'll really be finished if you go. She dashed in front of Gong Che in a few steps and grabbed his collar tightly. You're our Liu family's only hope. Nothing can happen to you, nothing can happen to you. Gong Che held her trembling hand. Mother, I'm already 16 years old. I shouldn't be protected by you anymore. This time, let me bear the responsibility. No. The Empress watched as the Crown Prince strode away. She fell to the ground. Looking at his back, The Empress was stunned for a moment as if she had gone crazy. Then, she hurriedly screamed. "Why are you still in a daze? Why are you still in a daze? Quickly stop His Highness." At this time, the imperial court was also in a turbulent situation. The Empress's father, the Right Prime Minister, was kneeling in the hall. All kinds of eyes were looking at him. The malicious intentions and vicious calculations made the 50-something-year-old official's hair stand on end. The Emperor in the lead was silent, and with every second he was silent, the Right Prime Minister found it harder to breathe. "It's over, it's all over." Who knew that every year, the Emperor would act out this year? Although this was a risky move, the Emperor was so vigilant. If the Emperor said that Long Guifei and Lu Xianfei were not involved, he would never believe it. This was clearly a conspiracy. Chapter 40. The Emperor looked at him coldly, feeling a headache coming on. He and the Empress had been husband and wife for more than 20 years. Although they did not love each other, they respected each other. However, the talents of the Lu family were withering day by day. They relied on their ancestors to ensure that there was an empress in this generation, but they could only stop here. It would be fine if the Empress did not make any mistakes. Once she did, those who were watching covetously could swallow the Lu family in an instant. This Right Prime Minister was really muddle-headed. Now that the evidence was conclusive, the letters they had secretly discussed fell to the ground. The Right Prime Minister could not help but cry. This is all because of this guilty official. It has nothing to do with the Empress or the Crown Prince. Your Majesty, please investigate clearly and allow this guilty official to bear all the responsibility. As he spoke, he kowtowed deeply. Unexpectedly, the Left Prime Minister, who was in charge of the Ministry of Revenue, snorted coldly. With so many people, it must be impossible to complete without the Empress order, right? As he spoke, he also knelt in front of the Emperor. Your Majesty, the evidence is conclusive. The Empress colluded with the Right Prime Minister, implying that they swapped goods with shoddy ones. And presumably, this is not the first time this has happened. Think about how our court sends disaster relief every year, but the food sent to Shi province is rotten. This is clearly framing the court for injustice. Your Majesty, please abolish the Empress. You! The Right Prime Minister's eyes widened. Although they had occasionally interfered with the relief supplies in the past, it was only a share of the profits. Yet the Left Prime Minister wanted to push all the blame to the Lu family. If the crime was confirmed, it would be a serious crime to confiscate the family's property and exterminate the family. But what he did not know was that there was a saying that everyone kicks a man who is down. Before he could defend himself, the courtiers all knelt down. Your Majesty, please abolish the Empress. He sat on the spot, as if he had aged 10 years in an instant. Just as the cries shook the heavens, Gong Che appeared alone at the door of the hall and knelt down with the letter of his own guilt. In the end, the Empress could not stop Gong Che. She stared blankly as the Crown Prince walked further and further away. Her eyes gradually sobered up. She asked someone to help her up, then returned to the hall and sat in front of the dressing table. First, she silently looked at herself in the mirror, then suddenly said, Hong Xiu, help me dress. The head palace maid beside her had red eyes. She hurriedly stepped forward and said in a choked voice, Your Highness, please take care of yourself. Everything will be fine. The Empress turned a deaf ear to him. She looked at the mirror and said faintly, Let's do it the same way we did during the coronation ceremony. She looked at her slightly plump waist and sighed. I wonder if I can still wear that phoenix robe. As soon as she finished speaking, another female official, who was her trusted aide, quickly knelt down and said, This servant will go and get it. There's no rush. Ruthlessness flashed in the Empress's eyes. Would she admit defeat just like that? No. She looked at herself in the mirror. She originally wanted to beg Imperial Concubine Long for mercy, but now, she gritted her teeth and changed her mind. Go to the Taiji Palace and invite the Chaoyang Princess over. Yes. That's right, how could she forget about Gong Yimo? The Empress touched her face and her thoughts became clearer. She could not admit defeat like this. Once she collapsed, her son, father, and clan would all face a calamity. At least she had to protect her son. Her child must be the crown prince. Gong Yimo had just returned to the palace when the Empress's people arrived. She did not know what had happened, nor did she know that the people around the emperor had used her plan to do so many things in order to overthrow the Empress. Therefore, she only hesitated for a moment before going to Feng Qi Palace with Imperial Concubine Long. On the way, she listened to Imperial Concubine Long's sarcastic explanation. Gong Yimo was shocked. She did not expect such a thing to happen. Someone actually used her to carry out such a plot against the Empress. In her last life, when she met Gong Che's mother and grandfather's family were all dead, so his position as the crown prince was very unstable and difficult. So it was at this time. Soon, they arrived at Feng Qi Palace. As soon as she entered, she saw the Empress, who was wearing a full set of phoenix robes, drawing her forehead. Seeing her like this, Gong Yimo felt that the Empress must have a death wish. Perhaps in her last life, it was because she took all the blame with her death that the Emperor did not remove Gong Che from the position of crown prince. Looking at her now, it seemed that she would really do that. When the Empress saw her, she was no longer as dissatisfied as before. Now, all the civil and military officials in the court were on their side. Only Gong Yimo, the vile spawn that she used to despise, could speak for her son. Thinking of this, she dismissed her confidence and actually knelt down in front of Gong Yimo. Gong Yimo looked at her actions and raised her eyebrows. Mother. Why do you have to do this? Could it be that the situation had deteriorated to this extent? Well, if there was still a chance, Gong Che would not have lost his mother so early in her last life. The Empress's expression was solemn. Seeing Gong Yimo's resistance, she gritted her teeth and kowtowed to her. The moment she lowered her head, 2 clear lines of tears fell. She was indeed a cowardly Empress. If there was no Gong Yimo, she would have gone to beg Imperial Concubine Long. But compared to Imperial Concubine Long's viciousness, the young Gong Yimo was obviously more compassionate. So she could kneel down and beg for her son's sake. Gong Yimo knew what she wanted her to do, but in the face of imperial power, she admitted that as a non-biological princess, she could please the emperor, but she could not change the emperor's decision or even influence the emperor's will unless she did not want to live. 7th Princess, everything that happened in the past was all my fault. I was the one who tried to harm you time and time again, and I was also the one who wanted to steal the disaster relief supplies this time. But, I beg you, for Che-er's sake, please let go of your former enmity and save Che-er's life. Her posture was as low as dust, and her every word was filled with grief and sorrow. Gong Yimo sighed. Empress. Let's not beat around the bush. I am not father's biological child. How much weight do you think my words have? The Empress opened her eyes slightly. She did not expect Gong Yimo to know her past, but there was no other way. She gritted her teeth and kowtowed again. Even if it's because Che has always taken care of you. Even if it's because of my efforts as a mother, I know that you, 7th Princess, can do it. You can definitely do it. Gong Yimo was speechless. She herself was not confident, but the Empress had confidence in her. Seeing her kowtow again and again, banging her head on the ground and crying blood, Gong Yimo closed her eyes and couldn't help being slightly moved. Perhaps all mothers in this world were like this, willing to do anything for their children. Thinking of her previous life, Gong Che was so difficult, but in the end, he was still a good emperor. She couldn't help but laugh at herself, but her mind was quickly guessing what the current situation was. Soon, the empress' forehead was red and swollen. The banging sound was like knocking on people's hearts, and could be heard clearly in the huge palace. After a while, Gong Yimo sighed, "Don't kowtow, I promise you." When the empress heard this, her eyes were filled with unbelievable joy. She raised her head and almost spoke incoherently, but her eyes were filled with determination. "Thank you. Thank you. Don't worry, I won't make it too difficult for you. As long as the princess agrees to do her best, I will immediately take poison and hang myself. I believe that on account of my death, His Majesty will have some pity for Che. I'm just afraid that those court officials will covetously eye on Che and not let him go. I asked the princess to speak up for Che. Just like how you spoke to the 9th prince. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.